You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. Secret military experiments, mysterious mannequin men, faulty tech with preternatural side effects, the problem of the causality keepers, the vengeful denizens of forgotten tunnels. Tell Me What You Know of Fear is a collection of my earliest works, from creepypastas such as The Fear Experiment and The Pit, to stories written exclusively for HorrorBabble, including They've Gotta Kill a View and VANITY Limited. The collection is available on the Kindle ebook store. You'll find a link to it in the video description below, as well as links to my second collection, That Time of the Night, which you can also listen to here on YouTube. I hope you enjoy this revamped edition of the collection, folks. The Fear Experiment. Introduction. In over 10 years of continuous travel, I have encountered many peculiar and fascinating individuals. Usually, the most interesting encounters are those with other travelers, men and women with no particular destination, or at least no destination they care to share. I like the idea that one can spend a fleeting evening with a stranger in the middle of a foreign metropolis, only to wave goodbye the following day and never hear from them again. We are merely ships that pass in the night. As I contemplate modern technology, social media and the like, I fear the ships are becoming all too visible. The subtle nuances, silent expressions, and secrets that define us are now exposed to the prying glow of a lethargic civilization spotlight. So I look to places where secrets still exist, hidden nooks and passageways, the world beneath the disembodied voice of the many, the past. And there, by chance, a friend and I encountered an individual so out of touch with the modern world that he could have passed for a ghost. In what could very well have been his last year on this earth, he told us of a strange and profound experiment he was party to in his youth. A cold winter's morning, February 2008, Kaleti train station, Budapest, Hungary. The train bound for Sighisoara, Romania, rolled in at around 11 a.m. If memory serves, its final destination was Bucharest. The journey time was estimated at 8 hours, so we were pretty sure we'd be spending the whole day on board. As well as the two of us, several others boarded. We located an empty compartment and stowed our luggage. Within 10 minutes, the train was ready to depart. Upon doing so, the ticket lady approached us almost immediately. I'll never forget the vacant look on her face as she studied my ticket. Some 5 or so minutes into the journey, an elderly gentleman clutching a brown leather briefcase opened the door to our compartment. He hovered in the doorway for several seconds before finally choosing to enter. Nodding in our direction as he entered, we responded in kind as he sat opposite us. His weathered face was chock full of gorge deep lines. My first thought was how unusual it was for an elderly gentleman to choose to join a pair of 20-somethings on a train that was practically empty. It would soon be revealed, however, that we were precisely the kind of company he was looking for. The man, who I came to refer to as Mr. Grey, sat in silence as he watched the world go by outside. My friend and I were idly gossiping, mostly about the things we had seen in Hungary, and would undoubtedly see in Transylvania. Towards the end of our conversation, the man carefully opened the brown leather briefcase atop his lap and began to inspect the contents. Among a bundle of papers, written in more than one language, were a number of Soviet military orders, all of which looked weathered and tarnished, rather like the man himself. He looked down at the orders and then back up at us, whispering in a thick Russian accent,
"Tell me what you know of fear."
The Man from Tbilisi, 1920s, Tbilisi, Georgia. Mr. Gray grew up in Tbilisi, Georgia, in the 1920s. His father was a military figure and a great admirer of Joseph Stalin. He claimed to have been heavily brainwashed in his formative years, becoming a strong believer in the Soviet regime and communism in general. So, when he approached adulthood, his heart was inevitably set on military service. Upon reaching the age of 18, he relocated to the Soviet Union, specifically Moscow. He rose to prominence as a young and dedicated officer with an increasing interest in the human condition. This he attributed to his commanding officer's interest in experimental psychology. Throughout the Second World War, Mr. Gray worked as a practicing psychologist in a Russian laboratory on the outskirts of Moscow. There, he and his commanding officer, a man whom he referred to as Mr. Red, conducted a variety of experiments on unwitting subjects, often prisoners of war, although it wasn't unusual for volunteers to arrive at the laboratory, including would-be soldiers unfit for frontline warfare. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Gray's interest in this field grew exponentially after the end of the Second World War, and almost a decade later, during the height of the Cold War, he was conducting his own experiments. Gabala, Azerbaijan, 1955. For reasons undisclosed, Mr. Gray relocated to Gabala, Azerbaijan, and established a psychological research facility with a team of 7 medical practitioners. The team was assembled to conduct a highly controversial and secret experiment dubbed Project Sleep, but for those of whom were involved, it would later come to be known as Project Fear. In their search for willing subjects, villages in the neighboring countries of Armenia, Russia, and Mr. Gray's native Georgia were systematically searched. Vague but intriguing advertisements were posted in strategic locations throughout small and often poor communities. Mr. Gray was carrying one of the advertisements in his briefcase. Written in Georgian, he read the text aloud in broken English, which, if translated, would have looked something like this on paper. Volunteers required, civil servants, medical research, well paid, support medical science. The applications poured in. 12 candidates were selected and subsequently invited to eligibility hearings. Of the 12 initially selected, 7 were formally invited to participate in Project Sleep. The experiment was to be conducted in 2 stages, though candidates would only be made aware of the first. Project Sleep, Stage 1. Candidates were to be kept awake for a period of 72 hours in solitary confinement. To ensure their consciousness, candidates were under constant supervision. Alarms were triggered remotely and repeatedly if candidates appeared to be falling asleep. Periodically, at the 24th, 48th, and 72nd hours, candidates were asked to describe their worst fear. As each period passed, 3 out of the 7 candidates exaggerated the fear they had initially described. For example, Candidate 2 had initially described a generic fear of crustaceans, specifically woodlice. Upon questioning at the 72nd hour, his fear was not only of woodlice, but of the possibility his closest friends and family members would eventually mutate into woodlice. The 48th hour brought about strange, dark fears for candidates 3 and 5, fears that greatly worried the practitioners. Unsurprisingly, though, The 72nd hour instilled a heightened sense of anxiety and paranoia in all 7 candidates, though it was specifically noted that Candidate 5 was said to be experiencing severe apathetic gloom. And then it was on to Stage 2. Even the notion of describing Stage 2 filled Mr. Gray with visible unease. He was sweating and clutching haphazardly at tattered bits of paper. I recall with perfect clarity the moment he withdrew a handkerchief and slowly wiped his brow. His motion was pained and unsteady, but in that instant I could have sworn his obscured mouth was grinning. Project Sleep, Stage 2. Upon completion of the 72nd hour, each candidate was permitted to sleep. In fact, they were given a sleeping agent which ensured they wouldn't be aware of what was to follow. All candidates were driven to a secret facility in the mountains somewhere outside Gabala. The team referred to it secretly as the Mansion. The sleeping candidates were strategically placed in various locations throughout the complex and were left to awaken naturally. The team allotted 24 hours for them to remain inside. The facility was locked from the outside, and metal panels were used to seal the windows. No surveillance equipment was used. They would rely purely upon the candidates' statements upon release at the end of the time period. It is interesting to note that, according to Mr. Gray, there was nothing particularly unusual about the facility, other than its convenient, isolated location. Results. Upon completion of the 24th hour, the mansion's heavy doors were opened. There, Mr. Gray and his team discovered 2 emaciated candidates, numbers 5 and 7. Following the first sweep of the facility, the remaining candidates were nowhere to be found, though bizarre evidence to suggest they encountered unspeakable things was everywhere. Candidate 5 was comatose, and as such was placed under supervision. Candidate 7, however, was surprisingly calm and coherent. He described an experience unlike anything any member of the team had heard of before. It began with him waking in a quiet room, one eerily similar to his bedroom at home in Armenia, and hearing strange sounds, including the fearful cries of unfamiliar voices. Approximately 10 minutes elapsed before a stranger burst into his room, shouting maniacally, alluding to an insect of giant proportions pursuing him throughout dilapidated, maze-like corridors. Ready to dismiss the stranger's story as nonsense, he became aware of a distant humming or buzzing sound. Some inexplicable winged creature was on the prowl, tirelessly searching for a victim to fulfill its unknowable desires. The stranger left the room amid uncontainable shrieks and disappeared into the darkness of a gloomy corridor. The buzzing sound continued for a while, until 7 heard what he could only describe as a blood-curdling scream. 7 exited the room, only to discover thick, coarse hairs strewn about the corridor, accompanied by sporadic pools of an unidentifiable viscous fluid. Mr. Gray and his team referred to the notes made during Stage 1 with Candidate 7. He had repeatedly described a fear of helplessness, a fear that had remained consistent even after sleep deprivation. And so, throughout Stage 2, as he wandered throughout the mansion, he continued to experience circumstances beyond his control. He described labyrinthine corridors surrounding him that seemed to grow in height as he explored them. Doors seemed to move away from him, and his attempts to open them failed. He repeatedly came upon dead ends, beyond which he heard manic voices, giving rise to the notion that the owners of those voices were being pursued. In the end, it was nothing more than blind luck that led Candidate 7 to the exit, and up until the moment the doors were opened, he had believed he was slouched against a cold brick wall rather than a set of perfectly ordinary oak doors. Mr. Gray's discoveries within the facility were both fascinating and horrifying. In what appeared to be confirmation of the presence of a large crustacean, the team discovered a giant exoskeleton, complete with a number of jointed limbs, and although it was retrieved for further analysis, it inexplicably disappeared from safe storage several days later. Puddles of coagulated blood were also discovered, supporting the idea that something malevolent had been wandering the halls, and furthermore, that someone or something had been injured. Mr. Gray looked at my friend and me with cold, vacant eyes.
"The experiment was a success,"
he said in that thick Russian accent.
"Although now I wish it hadn't been so."
Once again he reached into his briefcase and produced a bundle of papers. Further results. 1956. Undisclosed location, Azerbaijan. Candidate 5 spent almost 6 months in a coma and had been under constant medical supervision in an undisclosed location where the team hoped he would eventually recover. Much to their relief, he awoke on February 23rd, 1956. Several days passed before he felt well enough to discuss the events leading up to his coma. The middle-aged Azerbaijani librarian disturbed Mr. Gray and his team of practitioners with his account, so much so that all plans for subsequent experiments were abandoned. Mr. Gray recalled the librarian's unique fear, as described in Stage 1, the fear that human beings were vessels for a single, greater entity, a being with one desire, to compartmentalize itself into a theoretically infinite number of finite individuals. The fear intensified as the time periods passed, with 5 describing the entity as present in mammals, birds, and fish, but, more worryingly, present in all human beings, living and dead, an entity that took the form of absolutely everything capable of breath in an endless attempt to escape the truth of itself as an impossibly lonely, omnipotent being. Candidate 5's conclusion and ultimate fear was that he too was an aspect of this faceless mass of a thing, and that in a universe of infinite possibilities he would be forced to live every single inconceivably horrible life imaginable, from start to finish, over and over again, forever. In line with Project Sleep, deep within the walls of the mansion, this all-consuming fear came alive. And as it did, almost instantaneously, Candidate 5 saw through the eyes of the other candidates. He saw their fears and lived them. He watched as they fled from untold horrors and screamed each of their screams. His mind wandered further still, deep into the strange, half-imagined minds of the creatures made flesh by the candidates and their fears. He felt things only monsters were supposed to feel, and merged them with emotions unthinkable to man. And as this hapless wandering consumed him, his mind began to collapse, almost as though the matter in which he was made was coming apart, torn asunder by the unseen forces of an exotic dimension, a place where only fear, pain, and agonizing confusion could exist. And there he stayed for almost 6 months. Candidate 5 addressed Mr. Gray and his team, telling them of their fates, explaining the intricate, invisible tapestry binding each and every one of them together, regurgitating memories, thoughts, hopes, and dreams from the deepest and darkest recesses of their minds. After what Mr. Gray described as almost an eternity of outpouring, the Azerbaijani librarian returned to that deep, dark coma the team had found him in following the experiment. Train compartment. And so, Mr. Gray's conclusion was ironic. In what was supposed to be an experiment designed to study the depths of fear, he and his team of practitioners summoned what can only be described as man's deepest fear, the fear that he one day may know himself. I asked him what he meant by that. He said simply,
"Your question is proof that we aren't quite there yet."
Mr. Gray closed his eyes and slept. As the Carpathian Mountains rolled by the compartment window, I thought about the being, and the frightening possibility that Mr. Gray himself, and even my friend and I, on a quiet train rolling through Eastern Europe, could be nothing more than aspects of an unknowable, omnipotent creature. We reached our destination. Mr. Gray remained asleep. I took his photograph. A part of me wants to visit Gabala, Azerbaijan, to seek out the old facility in the mountains nearby. Will it be there? If the experiment truly was a success, shouldn't whatever was summoned still be there? I woke up in a box.
What? Where? Wait. No. Don't think. Just keep your cool. I listen carefully. Beyond the darkness, I'm pretty sure I hear voices. There's movement out there, and I'm moving. I'm in a box. Supine. A coffin, perhaps. Who's carrying me? Come to think of it, who am I? Can't remember anything. They're lowering the box. I'd better brace myself. Thud. Upright. Now what? I can still hear voices. Lots of them. Better keep my mouth shut for now. Just listen. Okay, I'm going to break out of here. I struggle a bit. Gotta be careful. Don't want to knock the box over. I raise a leg and kick. Crack! The wood splinters. Second kick. Shattered. A beam of light penetrates the box. Too much for my dark-adapted eyes. Ouch! Blindly, I thrust my body forward and burst out of the box. I land on cold cobbles. As my eyes adjust to daylight, I realize I'm surrounded. I have an audience. Why are these people looking at me? Some of them are smiling. Others are pointing cameras. Who are you people? I ask. Nobody replies. It's really cold. The strangers are wearing thick coats and scarves. I study my surroundings. The cobbled stones, the dark statues, flowing water, distant terracotta rooftops, and Gothic spires. I'm on a bridge. I've been here before. Charles Bridge, Prague. Several spectators wander off. What am I, some sort of street performer? Am I supposed to know what I'm doing here? I look down at my clothing. I'm wearing a pinstripe suit. It's a deep purple. Velvet. I touch my face. Damn, my face is thick with white face paint. What the hell? As the last two spectators depart, I frantically search my pockets for guidance. There has to be something... Aha! What's this? A scrap of paper? I unfold it impatiently. It reads, "Don't talk to strangers, lest they talk back." Right, This is going to be interesting. No memories whatsoever, and yet this has to be a joke, right? Got to be a game of some sort. Someone's idea of a game, anyway. I stand there shivering, puzzled. Snow begins to fall. In the same instant, someone approaches. Oh, she's beautiful. Do I know her? She speaks to me. Listen, I'm not a stranger. She speaks with an accent, but I can't place it. Have I heard it before? I decide to play it smart. The note states that I'm not to talk to strangers. Doesn't say anything against listening to them, so, in response to her, I simply nod. She continues. There are 3 bridge towers, 2 to the east. She points towards the eastern towers, connected by an archway, and the old town bridge to the west. She motions towards the lone tower on the opposite side of the bridge. Once again, I return a nod. There's a sniper in one of the towers. You get too close, he shoots. I'm aghast, so shocked that I almost break my silence. Before I can think of a way to acknowledge her, she's walking away, engulfed by the thickening snowfall. Too close? I mutter to myself. I'm dead center right now, surrounded by tourists and would-be photographers. Who on earth would want to shoot me? Who on earth could shoot me on a day like this? The snowfall is much too thick for a sniper to target me, isn't it? Oh great, a father and son combo have spotted me. I'm not here to entertain you, I think, but I'm too cold and confused to voice the words. So, I'm not to get too close. How does one define too close in a game of life and death? For surely this is what this is. I'll head towards the Old Town Bridge. The odds are in my favor in that direction, aren't they? Perhaps not. Perhaps that's what they want me to think. But that would be too blatant, wouldn't it? No. There's no point in trying to rationalize this. I've just got to get moving. I'll take my chances either way. I'm shuffling in the direction of the Old Town Bridge. Some glance at me, others ignore me altogether. Caricature artists sit side by side, unperturbed by the ever-increasing snowfall. I hear the dulcet tones of street performers in the distance, an accordion and a washboard, jaunty, irrelevant. I approach with caution. I recognize the melody. It's typical of the region, but where have I heard it before? Here, in this very spot? Possibly. As I work to stir the grey matter, a man in a duffel coat approaches me. A scraggly beard covers his face. A grey streak permeates it. I'm not a stranger, he starts. I've heard that before. Here, he says, offering me a piece of paper. I nod and accept it. I unfurl it. It reads, You argue with me, and you'll never know your name. Argue with him? I don't even know him. Should I recognize him? Who are you? I ask. Greybeard shakes his head. I have something to tell you, he says, moving closer. I hold my breath. The girl who approached you, she's a liar. She'll approach you again. Trust her at your peril. I hesitate. Why should I trust you? Again, Greybeard shakes his head and gestures towards the piece of paper. It's all there, he adds. Just as I'm about to query him further, he retreats into the hazy snowfall. I study the scrap of paper. It's wrinkled, the ink is smudged in several places. The handwriting is unfamiliar. What is it supposed to tell me? The cacophony of the street band continues to pummel my eardrums. I can't take it. I'm returning to the center of the bridge where it's safe. Cold, but safe. I have to take action. Have to trust my instincts. A man without an identity has little choice in the matter. So I return to where I started, face to face with the broken coffin, bits of broken wood splintering the black leather brogues I'm wearing. From out of the misty white steps the girl, the beautiful stranger with midnight hair and a pale complexion. Her breath on the cool air transfixes me as she prepares to speak. There's a second shooter. I nod, uncertain. What if everybody on this bridge is a liar? I gesture for her to continue. This one is on the bridge. The clock is ticking. Either make your choice and pick a direction, or wait for the second shooter to finish you off here among the crowds. Once again, the strange lady retreats into the snowfall. A second shooter? That's it, I'm screwed. I checked the girl's note. Black ink, typed, absolutely nothing noteworthy about it. What am I missing? I study the handwritten note the bearded fella handed me. Perhaps the devil hides in the detail. An anagram? Look closer, damn it. You. Argue. Name. My eyes are drawn to the same words over and over again. There's just something about those strokes. A familiar flick of the wrist, perhaps? A shape nears me. As I focus, I see a tall, featureless character, his or her hand buried inside the unseen depths of a long overcoat. The shooter! I retreat. Turning, I trot haphazardly. I yell incoherently as I flee, shoulder-barging strangers and hand-balling photographers, anxious to outrun my assailant. The odds are against me, though. Not only am I pursued by a menacing, lanky figure, but I'm heading east, towards 2 of the 3 towers. I gasp frantically in a desperate attempt to fill my lungs with oxygen. I near the towers. The Gothic monstrosities loom above the bridge, their spires heralding a fate unknown to me. The blank, glass-like glares of the myriad strangers I pass are piercing, seemingly aware of my plight, utterly heedless. And then I feel it, like nothing more than a whisper. I pause. There's a warmth in my belly. My hands investigate. My eyes follow. My brain lags behind. The warmth is wet, smells coppery, colored red. I drop to my knees, my eyes scanning the towers. Is someone up there? The other shooter? I see only the towers, giant harbingers of doom. Tombstones. The girl with the midnight hair approaches. I look longingly at her, but the sensation in my belly forces me to the ground. It stings a bit, but at least it's warm. One last look at the note in my hand. Those words. You. Argue. Name. Could it be? Cursive. Certain letters of the words in cursive. My blood-wet fingers string the letters together below the words. The result of my effort reads, Your game. And the words scrawled in blood match the words penned in ink. Both sets of handwriting, mine.
They've got a killer view. 1. It wasn't about the money. Patricia Wolstenholme had always been blessed financially, the recipient of a sizable inheritance at an early age. Flying from one side of the globe to the other was but a turn of the page, a spin of the wheel, a pass of the time. She had done it all, gazed upon the salt flats of Bolivia, meditated in the quiet hills of Delphi, knelt before Buddha at the Red Palace at Patala, ambled along the ancient walkways of Angkor Wat. But as she flew further and further, she sank deeper and deeper into a quagmire of longing and futility. It seemed her days were merely the result of tiresome transactions, and try as she might, she couldn't rid herself of the sycophants that sought to fulfill her desires. False as old Judas, she would say, sans the noose. Vainly, she looked to the world of high fashion, and bought into go-go boots and stilettos. When the 60s ran dry, she looked to the hippies and the gauchos, but again she quickly grew tired of the drone. No, it couldn't be about the money. It was about her, a shifting of perceptions. Her wealth, or rather the prestige it brought, attracted knowledge of the rare and extraordinary, ideas appealing to those who had done it all. Whispers within the circle she moved hinted at a thrill like no other, the ultimate thrill, one of solemnity and euphoria. Patricia, a regular guest at the humanitarian events and social gatherings of the philanthropist and media mogul Edward Hoffman, would frequently eavesdrop. They've got a killer view. Ted Hoffman had said, referring to what the tycoons of 1974 had dubbed God's Window. Big Ed proffered all manner of unlikely associations. He spoke of the explorer David Thompson, cuckoo sent to the natives, who had supposedly learned of the phenomenon during his navigation of the Columbia River, citing an encounter the mapmaker had once had with a medicine man in the mountains of British Columbia. Hoffman also referenced the occultist Aleister Crowley, who, whilst promoting his novel Magic, Book 4 in the United States, had supposedly caught a whiff of the rumors, subsequently investigating them to no avail. Ted even spoke of texts on Nazi mysticism that were said to mention it, further illustrating the allure of what was assuredly a rare and fascinating marvel. Patricia was sold. God's Window was the answer. But hard cash wasn't. Even Big Ed's billions held no sway over the Smiths. God's Window was exclusive. There was a waiting list, editions to which were reserved for those deemed worthy. The criteria were vague, and so Patricia sought the company of Hoffman's closest associates, one of which was rumored to be on the list. After months of inquiries, dinner dates, and supposed business meetings, Miss Wolstenholme was finally introduced to an individual with the influence necessary to secure a place for her on the list. The elderly gentleman, a retired industrialist from New York City, said there were no guarantees she would receive an invitation, and that there were terms, divisive terms, intended to discourage would-be attendees. But she had done it all, and was prepared to risk it all. 3 years passed before the then 42-year-old from Minneapolis was fortunate enough to receive an invitation. She was excited. For the first time in over a decade, she felt something. The Smiths had chosen her. She had cause to smile. The invitation, unabashed in its simplicity, read, "Patricia Wolstenholme, you are formally invited to attend a viewing. 10 a.m., Tuesday, November 25th, 1986. RSVP form enclosed. Directions over leaf. Kind regards, the Smith family." Patricia received the invitation on Monday, July 11th, 1977. She would have to wait almost a decade to attend a viewing. 2. What strange years they were. The woman who had done it all found a new way to live her life. By 1980, she had rekindled her love of travel and spent many long years exploring the national parks of her native United States. She climbed the granite peaks of Yosemite and beheld the grandeur of General Sherman at Sequoia and Kings Canyon. Plunging into the desert, she stood among the Joshua trees and emptied her lungs into the Grand Canyon. The Great Basin bristlecone pines taught her the persistence of life, and she sat beneath them late into the evening, their withered limbs pointing towards the stars. She smiled at the achingly dry badlands, wept at the receding glaciers of Glacier National Park, and marveled at the colorful eye of the grand prismatic spring as it absently fell upon her at dawn. The money that had meant so little to her before now supported the National Park Service and the conservation of wildlife. It all made sense, and the countdown continued. In 1983, she rediscovered music, and the 48-year-old went with the times. The new wave romantics held her heart in their hands, capturing her imagination. The melancholy cry of the synthesizer addressed her yearning, whilst the poetic baritone of Roland Orzabal sang her isolation. There was honesty in the air. In the heat of the moment, in which melodies were king, Patricia Wolstenholme found love again in the words of Tears for Fears, Duran Duran, and A Flock of Seagulls. And still, the countdown continued. It was 1986, and like a connect-the-dots puzzle, Patricia began to draw the lines. Her philanthropy, her country, her music, and her memories merged to form an image both fascinating and wonderful, a vision of the girl from Richfield, her life but an intricate web of moments, the most colorful tapestry of all. Her life had purpose. She was fulfilled. But then, it was November. 3. the 51-year-old from Minneapolis set out on the long journey to the Smith estate. Over several days, she drove alone in her Cadillac to the east, through the Black Mountains of South Dakota, the Devil's Tower of Wyoming, and north into the Indian reservations of southern Montana. It was there, in the Rocky Mountains of the Treasure State, that Patricia Wolstenholme found herself ascending the precipitous back roads that led her away from civilization. As per the directions, she reached the steep track enclosed by spruce and fir trees, signposted Smith. The trees bent and bowed in reverent gestures, seemingly aware of both the secret beyond and the rare opportunity the destination had afforded her. Snow had fallen, and it was clinging to the branches and the verges of the track. But the sky above was clear, perfect conditions for a viewing. The Cadillac emerged from the tree line and pulled up before a set of vast iron gates. A further track beyond climbed to a rather modest-looking timber lodge, nestled between several ponderosa pines, perched atop a pinnacle. Several snow-capped peaks dominated the lodge, fencing it in. Undoubtedly, the idyllic property overlooked a grand ridge or valley to the rear. The roaming eye of a security camera fixed itself upon Miss Wolstenholme's car, and moments later the iron gates opened inward, urging her to proceed. Patricia wasn't entirely certain what it was she had expected to find. The circles in which she had once moved indeed described a secluded property, but their machinations had insinuated a degree of uniqueness, evoking images of spectacle and grandeur. And though the location was assuredly spectacular, with its towering pines, majestic bighorns, and expansive vistas of the Rocky Mountains, the property itself was little more than a log cabin. But it was what awaited her inside that would render her suppositions inert. Pulling up alongside a battered-looking jeep, she turned off the engine. The winter chill was immediately at the window. The fingers of Jack Frost tapped that inimitable seasonal melody. Emerging from the vehicle, she made a dash for the lodge. As she ascended the wooden steps, a tall, elderly Native American gentleman in a buckskin jacket, elaborate breechcloth, and feathered war bonnet greeted her on the porch. He nodded a salutation as old as time itself, and ushered her in, out of the cold. Patricia thanked the stranger, and stepped into the warmth of the lodge. The interior of the property was, in Miss Wolstenholme's mind, very typical: leather furniture, aspen log tables, pebble fireplace, and deer antler chandeliers. An exquisite grandfather clock met her gaze. Its ornate hands told her the time. It was 9:57 a.m. Patricia's host proffered the name Horse before leading her into a larger sitting area to introduce her to his wife. The pair were the long-time proprietors of the lodge, their lineage going back millennia. The girl from Richfield learned the Smith name was but a front, and she revisited those rumors pertaining to the mapmaker David Thompson and the medicine man he had allegedly conversed with along the banks of the Columbia River centuries before. Mr. Horse confirmed the appointment, specifying 10:23 as the commencement of her viewing. Little else was said. Protracted silences reigned. This unnerved Miss Wolstenholme, who, under considerable duress, was beginning to doubt the veracity of the situation. Eventually, Mr. Horse climbed to his feet and asked Patricia to accompany him. They strolled in the direction of the stairs, past the wooden owls and buffalo hides, and began to climb. Reaching the top of the lofty flight, Patricia was met by 3 colorful tapestries, each the result of extraordinary design and craftsmanship, in terms of tone and texture. But it was the leftmost of the 3, a vivid depiction of what was certainly a local alpine ravine, that brought her to tears. The delicacy of the weave, coupled with a truly sublime mastery of color, instilled in her feelings of immense solemnity and euphoria. She wept openly. But it wasn't yet 10:23, and this elegant tapestry wasn't what she had waited so long to see. Her host observed her tears and nodded perceptively. It was then that he revealed the true nature of the secret. The phenomenon was transient, he said, and as such opportunities to gaze upon it were incredibly rare. He spoke of those who had come before, the rich and the poor, the vain and the desperate, each of them pleading for passage to that which none should ever wish to see. But he was neither judge nor jury, he said, and the decision was and would always be in the hands of the individual. Miss Wolstenholme learned that there had never been a selection process, no worthy or unworthy. It was just a test, a simple test of will. And there she was. Mr. Horse continued by speaking of his diligence and commitment to those who made the pilgrimage to his door, how he and his quiet wife tended to them both physically and spiritually throughout the experience. Patricia's host spoke with conviction, and his sentiments resonated with her on a level previously dormant. But she had to go on, had to see it with her own eyes. She was guided to a small door towards the back of the lodge. Mr. Horse opened it. Within was an empty room, dimly lit, with a large pair of green velvet curtains drawn together on the far side. The elderly gentleman walked her to the curtains and rested her hand upon the small wooden handle of a drawer-cord. Into her other hand he placed a vintage pocket watch. Its delicate hands displayed 10:14. "The window is brief," said Mr. Horse. "You must draw the cord at precisely 10:23, not a moment before. It will last approximately 40 seconds, though most folks conclude in 20. Be steadfast." And with those words he retreated from the room, closing the door behind him. The heart of the middle-aged woman from Richfield was beating rapidly, eerily synchronized with the ticking of the gold watch in her hand. 10:15, 8 minutes. All she had to do was draw the cord, a simple motion really, to reveal that which she had sought her entire life, the ultimate thrill. But the doubt she had felt just minutes before clouded her judgment. She reflected upon her 51 years of life, conjuring memories both blissful and blue, looking to the past for an answer to her present predicament. Would it be everything she hoped it would be? Her definitive moment spent clutching an antique pocket watch in an empty room? 10:19, 4 minutes. Sweat streamed from her brow, and her breathing became erratic. But it didn't matter, for Patricia was certain such trivial human sensations would be rendered inert in the moments to follow. But was she certain? Life without loved ones, particularly parents and close friends, is a challenge all must eventually face. But regardless, the planets keep on spinning and the stars keep on shining. Wasn't the phenomenon merely a part of that bigger picture? 10:21, 2 minutes. Her life, the tumultuous journey she had endured for over half a century, wasn't the result of the phenomenon, nor was it the result of fate or destiny. It was the product of Patricia Wolstenholme's choices, the many paths she had chosen to pursue, in order to hike the mountains of the world, explore the forests of her native country, and to contribute to the sustenance of all things great and small over the preceding years. 10:22, 1 minute. No, it wasn't about the phenomenon. It was about her, a shifting of perceptions. Glancing at the watch in her hand, she stared as the second hand ticked relentlessly in the direction of 12. Her damp palm clutched the drawer cord as the seconds disappeared, the countdown approaching single figures. 10, 9, 8. But she relented. Simultaneously, she dropped the watch and loosened her grip on the drawer cord. The watch observed the passing of seconds 7 and 6 before it landed upon the polished wooden beams of the empty room and shattered into 100 pieces. Patricia Wolstenholme dropped to her knees, and once again she wept. In response to the commotion, Mr. Horse re-entered the room and approached her swiftly. Helping her to her feet, he guided her out of the room, and once again closed the door behind them. "It was a test of will," he whispered. Patricia Wolstenholme smiled and savored the overwhelming sensations of solemnity and euphoria. Life would go on. God's window would remain open. Peter Craft, model citizen. Few things haunt me the way the memory of Peter Craft does. Seasoned though I was, 24 years on the force and a decorated officer, a single lifetime was insufficient in its capacity to prepare me for an evening in his company. Generally speaking, Raleigh is a quiet British town, its criminal fraternity inconspicuous compared to its counterparts in the neighbouring cities of Preston and Manchester. So, when Craft was brought in for questioning all those years ago, I was unwise as to the nature of his alleged crime. Looking back, perhaps it was nothing more than his ability to draw breath. The arresting officer, a young upstart by the name of Ferguson, who was doing his rounds down by Moor Park, was approached by a young lady who, she claimed, had become a little concerned regarding the presence of a strange man watching the kids on the park. The lady, the mother of 2 small children, directed Ferguson to a bench on the periphery of the play area. There, he discovered the unusual fellow sitting quite peacefully, head in the clouds. Though the odd character was indeed close to the play area, Ferguson noted an absent expression upon his face, a face which, oddly, was smeared haphazardly with white face paint. The young officer was more than a little disturbed by the man's outward appearance, his clothing more akin to costume than common attire. The stranger was unresponsive as Ferguson questioned him, and as a result of his silence, the young officer took the decision to arrest him. Perhaps formal questioning would open him up. There were no protests, just the recognized mechanics of compliance. Some 10 minutes later, Ferguson arrived at the station, Craft in tow. It was there, in the diffuse lighting of the interrogation room, that I first laid my eyes upon him. Strange though his presence was, I couldn't help but think a stronger word was required to describe the man's peculiarity. Abnormal, perhaps? He wore a tight-fitting black suit, beneath which sharp, protruding shoulders pointed towards the ceiling. Appallingly thin, the garment served only to exaggerate his cadaverous proportions. Truly a shocking display of malnourishment. Or worse. Though outwardly youthful in appearance, his gait was awkward, like the laboured progression of a man advancing in years. But the body was merely an introduction to the man's staggering irregularity. The face, his face, I just couldn't fathom the details my eyes were presented with. The thick white paint masking every inch of flesh was cracked about the eyes and mouth, horribly unsettling. Mounds of black, unnatural hair spilled onto his forehead, assuredly a toupee. Lips, tastelessly smothered with red lipstick, served only to accentuate the total lack of definition there. And dark, bloodshot eyes, glaring at me from the depths of some unknowable abyss, screamed disillusionment. Or was it childlike wonder? That look, that very first look, I can see it now. Oh, how carefully Craft studied me. Seated opposite me, separated only by a simple article of furniture, his amorphous, protruding jaw threatened to open. No words came out. A set of perfect teeth gleamed at me. Even that troubled me. "What's your name?" I asked. He opened his mouth again, this time managing Pieter. Pieter. His voice lacked character, lacked inflection. "Surname?" I continued. "Craft. Craft." I nodded. "What were you doing in the park today, Mr. Craft?" Craft hesitated, but his eyes never left mine. I do not know." "You weren't up to no good, were you, Mr. Craft?" My question seemed to puzzle him, his brow furrowed, cracking the paint there. "No good?" he echoed. "Yes, no good. Were you watching the children, Mr. Craft?" He simply shook his head. The look of bewilderment remained fixed upon his made-up face. Ferguson, who was loitering in the shadows behind me, leaned forwards and whispered in my ear, To be fair, boss, I didn't see him eyeing up the kids. He was just staring into space. It was bloody weird. I nodded in acknowledgement. I awoke about an hour ago. Kraft started and paused before clarifying. I awoke on the bench. Are you homeless, Mr. Kraft? His pointy shoulders shrugged. I do not know. That white face. I felt incredibly uncomfortable conversing with the man. Why the face paint? I pressed. Kraft simply leaned to his left and glared at himself in the two-way mirror behind me. He shook his head, replying, I do not know. I turned to Ferguson for reassurance. Ferguson shrugged. Okay, Mr. Kraft, I continued. How long were you asleep on the bench? Once again, Kraft answered, I do not know. But before I could question him further, gloved hands emerged from beneath the table. He placed them delicately upon the surface and spoke. First I saw the trees, tall and green. The light hurt my eyes. I had to look away. Then I saw the park, the children on the swings, back and forth, back and forth. The motion made me dizzy. So I looked at the ground, saw more things, the litter and the insects, the ants. The ants were busy, working. I liked the ants. Then my eyes felt better. So I looked to the clouds, the fluffy shapes in the sky, white, blue, like a dream. Throughout his rambling speech, Kraft never once broke eye contact. Oh, how it bothered me. Climbing to my feet, I motioned to Ferguson. Excuse us, Mr. Kraft. Kraft simply nodded as the two of us left the room. Standing in the corridor, Ferguson and I discussed the possibility that the strange man in our interrogation room might just be a patient at Western Hospital, a psychiatric facility on the outskirts of town. Coincidentally, we were approached by a member of front counter staff, Leighton, who advised us of the arrival of a doctor from Weston, a man by the name of Philip Stanton Gordon. I met with Dr. Gordon in the reception area, who, quite oddly, bore a striking resemblance to the peculiar fellow sitting quietly in the interrogation room. The similarities were difficult to deduce, though, as one had to take into account the large quantity of paint masking Kraft's face. Politely, I introduced myself, and the gentleman acted in kind, the delivery of his words slow and considerate. Allegedly, Kraft was indeed a patient at the hospital, and had, and I quote, wandered off the premises earlier that morning. Concerned for Kraft's well-being, Dr. Gordon claimed the station was naturally his first port of call. When I queried Kraft's unsettling appearance, Gordon added a curious and somewhat convenient nugget of data. Kraft and several other patients were dressed and made up as such due to the pending arrival of Halloween, a mere 3 days away. I was understandably dubious. If the good doctor was to be believed, we had in our midst a lone psychiatric patient in full costume who just so happened to wander into town, alone and without guidance. My dubiousness persisted. Dubious or not, the events that followed were truly inconceivable. Suspicious and doubtful, Ferguson and I accompanied the good doctor to the observation room in order to allow him an opportunity to confirm that the man in custody was in fact one of his patients. There was a confirmation, all right, but it manifested itself in an incomprehensible, horrifying form that I still have trouble with to this day. The awkward, distorted figure of Pieter Kraft stood upright before the two-way mirror, his white face practically touching the glass. Although he appeared to look at us, he looked only at himself. Engaged in some probing, arcane study, Kraft slowly removed his gloves, revealing smooth, china-like hands, lacking fingernails. Coupled with what I believed was a total lack of facial hair, I later concluded that had he stopped there, I would have labelled him a recipient of Christ-Siemens terrain syndrome. But he hadn't stopped there. A bold index finger ventured towards his left temple. He pinched the flaky paint there and began to peel. Away it came, revealing further china-like flesh, smooth, white, and blemish-free. Kraft continued to peel and flay, until all that remained was an abstract, inorganic visage, a porcelain head. Other than those awful perfect teeth, the only remaining human element were those bloodshot eyes, agonized, watery spheres staring longingly at their own reflection, a terrible, penetrating vision. I swear that hideous gaze met my own. Aghast, I turned to Dr. Gordon. I found no comfort there, just a curious look of familiarity and inevitability. With a crippling lack of dexterity, Kraft yanked at the black toupee and tossed it aside. The mannequin form almost fully realized. 2 tiny apertures either side of his smooth head marked precisely where ears might once have been. Then came one final demonstration of self-mutilation. Kraft slid 2 blunt fingers and a clumsy thumb into his left eye socket and caressed the bloodshot orb residing there. Calmly and without hesitation, he extracted the eyeball and held it for a few seconds in front of his remaining eye. He tossed it aside as yellow, viscous fluid began to ooze from the open hollow. I gasped. Ferguson heaved. Dr. Gordon vacated the room. I assumed he was going to intervene, to stage the big reveal, just a horror show, an elaborate prank. No intervention, no revelation followed. Gordon disappeared. Kraft remained. Ferguson and I were left staring into the remaining eye of the mannequin man who had, not but 10 minutes ago, introduced himself as Pieter Kraft. Who or what he was would remain a mystery. The nightmare vision of Kraft in his final glory served only to open doors Ferguson and I would forever wish we could close. Before collapsing to the floor as nothing more than a macabre mixture of porcelain, mustard, and cheap fabric, Kraft uttered through perfect teeth, "I'm falling apart."
VANITY Limited. Statement of Steve Taylor, VANITY Limited Tech Support. Mr. Berman was one of the annoying ones, you know. One of those who always found problems with the equipment. He'd already been through 3 units before his complaint was referred to me, and I was fretting about the 4th, a brand new unit at that. Given his reputation as a bit of a time waster, customer services put the complaint through on a standard, with a 3 to 5 day turnaround. A mistake? Possibly. But they couldn't have known the problem was unprecedented. It was a 3rd-generation unit, for goodness sake. 1. March 1st. The delivery driver, a stout chap in his late 40s, pulled up outside the secluded cottage of Mr. Mark Berman at approximately 8:55 a.m. It was a chilly morning in the British Midlands. Frost from the previous night coated the uneven flags leading up to the door. The courier struggled up the pathway with what was assuredly an awkward package, a rectangular cardboard box some 6 feet in height, a foot in width, and another half a foot in depth. Luminous yellow tape surrounded the box, the word fragile emblazoned on it in bold black lettering. The cardboard itself was grey, upon which numerous instances of the words VANITY Limited were visible. As the courier successfully reached the door without stumbling or dropping the hefty package, the unassuming Mr. Berman emerged from the warmth of the cottage. The man was around 30 years old, sporting a healthy paunch and a penchant for unkempt, receding hair. His eyes were a little too close together, complementing a bird-like, angular face and a sheer rock forehead. Thin lips curled upwards in an artificial smile, as the courier, under considerable duress,
staggered into the vestibule with the box, and set it down without incident. Berman, a man of few words, signed for the item, smiled again wanly, and sent the courier on his way. Closing the door, he clutched the box and painstakingly shimmied it from the vestibule into what was apparently some sort of dining room cum study. Armed with a utility knife, he hastily tore it open, marvelling at the package within. It was a box within a box. The tatty outer shell gave way to a more sophisticated cardboard, finished to resemble brushed steel. Italicized lettering across the front of the package read, "True Reflection. It sees the real you," under which, in smaller lettering, were the words, "By Vanity." Impatiently, Berman attacked the box with a utility knife, stripping the glossy cardboard back to reveal yet another layer of packaging, bubble wrap. He tore it off, eager to claim his prize. And it was done. There before him stood Vanity's latest and ardently coveted model of the freestanding digital display system, True Reflection. The device was now in its third generation, boasting true photorealistic rendering and true speech emulation. Berman had owned more than one of each of the previous generations, and hoped the latest model would be free of the frustrating flaws inherent in its forerunners. At a passing glance, one could almost be forgiven for mistaking True Reflection as nothing more than a freestanding mirror, with its vertical orientation, brushed steel frame, and adjustable mount. And that's precisely what it was, though its internal components were capable of transforming it into something much more than your average looking-glass. The balding 30-year-old nibbled at his fingers as he ran his eyes over True Reflection's matte display screen. It was perfectly smooth, and he likened its featureless surface to that of a black hole in deep space. It absorbed all available light, casting no reflection whatsoever. The screen was a marvel of engineering, and a vast improvement on its predecessors. Mark salivated with excitement. Rummaging through the torn cardboard and bubble wrap, Berman located the power cord. Hastily connecting the female to the system, he proceeded to connect the opposing three-pronged plug to the nearest wall socket. True Reflection drank greedily from the source of electricity, and 3 red lights appeared at the base of the unit. The display screen illuminated, coupled with Vanity's patented synth string jingle, a rather joyous F major 7th chord. Then the system greeted its new owner.
"Hello, Mark,"
It said in a sublime female voice.
"I am True Reflection, version 3.0.
Fully operational, the display screen was now a functioning looking-glass. Berman glanced at his reflection fleetingly, before the familiar sense of self-loathing forced him to look away. Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a smartphone, and following a fingerprint scan, launched the True Reflection app. Selecting a previously saved template labeled Blue-Eyed Mark, he nibbled at his fingers again, as a modified photograph of himself was downloaded from Vanity's servers. Upon completion of the download, Vanity's melodious jingle sounded again. Using the on-screen editing tools, Mark made some additional changes to what was already a heavily edited image, eyes from brown to blue, and a cheekbone sharpener, and hit cast. On the display screen, the unwelcome bird-like features of Berman were instantly replaced by those of the modified image. And what a sight it was! The voluptuous hair, the chiseled jaw, and the wild sapphire eyes. Now he could look at himself. Now he could daydream. Now he could masturbate. But there was a setback. True Reflection's display screen flickered, and the unit promptly shut down. The perfect face of Blue-Eyed Mark disappeared. Several iterations of profanity escaped Berman's lips. Once again, he was forced to contact Vanity for assistance. The phone call, lengthy and expensive, went much as Mark expected it to. The customer services agent, Diane, offered a service window of 3 to 5 working days.
3 to 5 days?
Berman had raged.
4 fucking machines, 4 fucking complaints, 3 to 5 fucking days?"
But his colourful language had no effect on the young agent. Berman, unfortunately, would have to wait 3 to 5 working days for a home visit. 2. March 2nd. The following morning, as Berman strolled into the dining room cum study, clutching a mug of black coffee, he paused. True Reflection had come back online. There was something odd about it. Though the sleek display screen reflected the room faithfully, his image was entirely absent. Withdrawing his smartphone, he launched the True Reflection app. Selecting a template labeled Nordic Mark, he hit Cast. Vanity's heavenly jingle sounded, but the display screen remained blank. Utilizing the app's camera mode, he took a photograph, successfully capturing his morning face, bloated cheeks and all. Making a couple of minor adjustments to the image, eyes from brown to green, and a close shave, he hit Cast again. True Reflection's display screen flickered briefly, but that was all. It remained entirely free of Mark's image. Unsatisfied with the idea he had inherited the properties of a vampire, he took another photograph, in this instance choosing to leave the image unedited. Once more, he hit Cast, and again the display screen flickered before returning to its plain reproduction of the unoccupied room. Berman shook his head in disbelief. Returning to the kitchen, he approached the coffee pot, which was still steaming on the windowsill above the countertop. Glancing outside, he watched the morning mist as it tumbled through the greenery of the mature garden, filtering through the silver birches at the far end. With eyes deceived by both steam and fog, Berman caught sight of a motionless figure amid the pruned rose shrubs. The creeping vapor seemed to animate it, giving flow to its long blonde hair. As the steam from the coffee pot reduced to a wisp, Mark locked eyes with the stranger, and saw that it was a man, a handsome man, who, oddly, bore a striking resemblance to himself. A horrifying thought crossed his mind, followed by a shocking moment of realization. The gentleman in the garden was a template, an edit produced for True Reflection, the image labeled Nordic Mark. Berman's life changed in that instant, concluding that his malfunctioning third-generation True Reflection had somehow projected Nordic Mark into the real world. But how could such a thing be? Retreating from the kitchen, Berman once again launched the True Reflection app and promptly deleted the offending template. But the reproduction remained in the garden. Berman executed the Erase Cast History command. But still, the queer facsimile remained in the garden. In a last-ditched attempt to be rid of the unnecessarily handsome doppelganger, Mark unplugged True Reflection and watched as the reflected image of the dining room cum study disappeared from the display screen. But Nordic Mark remained in the garden, still, silent. Wiping beads of sweat from his brow, Berman contemplated the mysterious guest. He sipped chronically at the mug of coffee, and once again nibbled at the raw and flaking flesh about his fingernails. He reached a decision. He would step outside and face the abomination. With one last sip of coffee, he placed the mug on the countertop, moved from the kitchen to the utility room, and opened the back door. The mist had cleared somewhat, revealing the true ghastly nature of the facsimile. Mark approached it tentatively. "Hello?" he muttered. Nordic Mark remained silent. Berman gulped audibly upon noticing that the figure was in fact breathing, albeit rather slowly. "Hello?" Mark voiced again. But still, the reproduction remained unresponsive. As the balding 30-year-old neared the figure, he noticed unnatural imperfections, smooth white flesh and a lack of fingernails, straw-like hair and blank, mottled eyes. Below its bulbous nose, a cavernous mouth continued to draw air. Berman reached out and touched Nordic Mark's pale hand, eliciting no response. The flesh was supple, but it was cold and sleek.
You should come inside,"
Berman stated, and gripped the creature's hand firmly. Nordic Mark blinked, and as its marbled eyes observed Berman's hand upon its own, it scowled and glared back up at him. Its face was a mask of pure hatred, its dark eyes the hollow suggestion of vicious intent.
What's wrong?"
Mark asked hesitantly. What had merely been a scowl was now a distortion. It bared its teeth. The facsimile wanted to eat Berman alive. Mark fled back to the house. Leaping into the utility room, he locked the door behind him and immediately turned to look upon his pursuer. And there it was, ambling across the grass like a toddler taking its first steps. But before the once handsome figure had made it even halfway across the garden, it stumbled forwards onto the stone path and shattered into a number of uneven pieces.
"Holy fucking shit!"
was all Berman could muster up. Taking the decision to leave the accidental creature in the garden, he quickly returned to the dining room cum study. Pulling out his smartphone, he once again launched the True Reflection app. Consulting the FAQ, he wasn't particularly surprised to find no mention of metaphysical manifestations. Still sweating and quite terrified, he put the phone down on the dining table, pulled out one of the chairs, and sat. In what was supposed to be a moment of reflection and contemplation, Berman was startled by a thud in the room above. His bedroom. With the bump came the hideous realization that the subsequent casts following that of Nordic Mark may too have been inadvertently projected into the cottage and/or garden. Mark climbed to his feet and slowly moved in the direction of the stairs, arming himself with a large paperweight along the way. Reaching the bottom of the flight, he heard the disconcerting thud again. A shiver passed through his bones. Berman wasn't cut out for such insanity. His experience was simply that of an introverted loner. Encounters with figments of his imagination were quite simply unheard of. He slowly climbed the stairs, one step at a time, listening. No further thuds were heard. Reaching the landing, he veered to his immediate left and climbed the additional 2 steps to his bedroom. The door was ajar. Pushing it open tentatively, he was relieved to discover an empty room. However, the walk-in wardrobe was closed, and within was enough space for a clone or two. Nervously, paperweight in hand, he crept up to the wardrobe and pulled open the double doors. Instantly, light fell upon the interior space, and a green-eyed, stubble-free variant of himself spoke aloud. "Hello?" Mark let out a startled shriek and brought the paperweight down upon the head of the disturbingly faithful facsimile. The paperweight crumpled its skull like tinfoil, the force of the impact catapulting a marbled, emerald eye across the room. The clone collapsed to the carpeted surface of the walk-in wardrobe, and a pale blue liquid streamed from what remained of its head. Berman promptly heaved and produced a liquid of his own. He was down to the dry heaves before he found the composure to glance again at the devastated remains of green-eyed Mark. But it wasn't over. There was another facsimile in the cottage. There had to be. 3 casts, 3 clones. And so he proceeded across the hall and checked bedrooms 2 and 3. Nothing. He checked the bathroom, including the shower cubicle and the tub. Empty. Downstairs, he checked the living room and the water closet. All clear. The kitchen was an open space, as was the dining room cum study, so that just left the crawl space at the top of the stairs. "Fuck," Mark mumbled under his breath, his fingers tightening around the paperweight. Returning to the top of the stairs, he approached the wooden panels concealing the entrance to the crawl space
and crouched before it. The hatch was aligned with the panels, rendering it invisible to the naked eye. Berman feared the prospect of opening it, and so instead knocked. After a moment, something knocked back. "Hello?" Mark mumbled. On the other side of the hatch, a similar voice echoed. "Hello?" "Are you dangerous?" Berman continued. "No," the clone answered. "Are you sure?" Mark reiterated. "I don't want to have to hurt you." "I'm sure," the clone insisted. Berman opened the hatch and saw the very same trousers he himself was wearing. "Come on out," Mark invited. The clone stooped and crawled out of the hatch. Climbing to its feet, it stood at precisely the same height as Berman, and, disturbingly, it was literally his true reflection. He shuddered, recalling the last cast, the subject of which had been an unedited photograph of himself as he had appeared that very morning. That horrible face he loathed, the bird-like features, the disproportioned ears, the pinpoint pupils, the receding hairline, the oily complexion, gazed back at him, faithfully reproduced by the malfunctioning true reflection. And it was all the worse, for he could smell its odor, his odor, and could taste it in the back of his throat. Simultaneously, the two Marks were on the dry heaves. Simultaneously, the two Marks fainted. 3. March 3rd. When Berman finally regained consciousness, he was forced to consult his watch to determine the date and time. Somehow, he had been out cold for over 16 hours, as it was after 1 a.m. on the morning of March 3rd. His doppelganger, Mark II, was nowhere to be seen. Climbing to his feet, Berman heard the familiar tones of buttons being punched on a smartphone. The faint sounds were coming from downstairs, specifically the dining room cum study, intermittently punctuated by that incessant vanity jingle. "Oh, shit," he managed. Descending the stairs at speed, Mark clumsily burst into the dining room cum study. There, in the dimly lit space by the mantelpiece, Mark II was sat cross-legged in front of True Reflection, Berman's smartphone in his hand. True Reflection was back online, and, as before, it still appeared to be malfunctioning, reflecting the room, but not its inhabitants. "What are you doing?" Mark yelled, addressing the clone. "What I should have done to begin with," the doppelganger answered. "I'm running a diagnostic." "What the hell for? You need to turn that thing off," Mark barked, pointing at the display screen. "It's caused enough bloody trouble as it is." "You think I don't know that?" Number 2 returned. "I've got a bloody clone running amok." Berman gulped, his anxiety increasing. "Fucking hell," he yelled. "You're the fucking clone here. You're lucky I haven't done away with you like I did the others." His comment seemed to distract Mark II momentarily, and in that instant, Berman happened to glance at the phone in the clone's hand. As instructed by the diagnostic tool, the disillusioned facsimile had queued up dozens of templates and was about to hit cast. "Don't you fucking dare!" Berman yelled, lunging towards his doppelganger. But it was too late. Mark II tapped the large green icon, and a batch process was executed. As Mark collided with the clone, the smartphone fell out of its cigar-like fingers and crashed onto the mantelpiece. The display screen shattered on impact, rendering the device inert. "What the hell are you doing?" Mark II demanded, clawing at Berman in an attempt to crawl out from under him. "I was trying to stop you from casting, you stupid bastard!" Berman exclaimed. "You do realize what's going to happen, don't you?" "Of course," the clone casually replied. "As part of the diagnostic process, the app will batch process a number of casts in order to weed out bugs." "Bugs?" Mark practically screamed. "Programming errors and the like," Number 2 replied calmly. "Fuck my life," Berman muttered, shaking his head. Mark II smiled. "Don't worry, it'll take a while to process," it said, in a peculiarly reassuring tone of voice. In the meantime, I'll put some coffee on and we can talk about what we're going to do with you."
"Do with me?" Mark quizzed, aghast.
"Do with me? You're the fucking accident here."
Number 2 just shook its head.
"Come on, calm down. Let's go get some coffee."
And with that, Berman's identical clone strolled out of the dining room cum study. Mark frowned and glanced up at True Reflection's display screen. There was something sinister about it now. It towered over him like his master. Its refusal to reproduce his image was a reflection of its contempt towards him. The system was, after all, very familiar with the balding 30-year-old. Berman's true account was synchronized with the third generation of True Reflection and its predecessors, and consequently, it was privy to his casting habits and the archive of disturbing images he had doctored over the years. Perhaps the third generation, with its true central processing unit and true artificial intelligence, disliked the pitiful loner and loathed his wanton desires, particularly that most frequent of casts, the controversial template labeled She-Mark. Berman had spent many an evening in front of She-Mark. The first-generation rendering had been somewhat pixelated, but it had served its purpose. The second generation had improved upon its forerunner greatly, especially in its rendering of the eyes and areolas. But She-Mark was Berman's private creation. The machine was incapable of passing judgment, wasn't it? Berman panicked. The clone-turned-barista had executed a diagnostic, an operation designed to eliminate errors by repeatedly casting previously generated templates. She-Mark was on its way, as was the recently crumpled green-eyed Mark, and the violently unstable Nordic Mark. China Mark and Thai Mark, they were coming too. Not to mention Dreamy Mark, Cloudy Mark, and Fairy Mark. And, God help him, Cripple Mark and Ampere Mark. All those weird and wonderful templates he had so fervently gazed upon, they were soon to be his uninvited guests. Leaving the dining room cum study, Berman joined Mark II in the kitchen. But to his horror, he wasn't alone. The diagnostic's repetition of Mark's last cast, the unaltered image of himself, had spawned another identical clone, Mark III. Swallowing audibly, Mark joined the pair and accepted the mug of coffee the clone to his left offered him. It said, "Turning into a bit of a situation, this, isn't it?" "You can say that again," the clone to Mark's right answered. "Neither of you are supposed to be here," Mark barked, addressing the pair in a vicious tone, nervously sipping at the mug of coffee. Before the clones could respond, the door to the living room swung open, and in strolled a brand new reproduction of Green-Eyed Mark. Eyeballing its new company, it said, "Hello?" "Hello," the clone to the left of Berman returned. Noting its eyes, it added, "Green eyes. At least we can tell you apart from the three of us." Green-Eyed Mark, its pearly skin glossy and marbled eyes glazed, muttered once again, "Hello?" Berman, caught in a web spun of his own vanity, placed the coffee mug on the table and held his head in his hands. What on earth was he going to do? How could this improbable series of events be reversed? It was the dead of night. His smartphone was shattered. Vanity had provided a 3 to 5 day window. Above all else, the situation was utterly absurd. He lifted his head, afraid to look upon his accidental siblings. And then he noticed that the motion sensor light out in the garden had been triggered. The 4 Marks, green-eyed included, approached the kitchen window and peered out into the misty garden. The flowing vapors were phantom-like in the glow of the security light. As before, a figure was standing among the flowers of the mature garden. As the mist dissipated, the group beheld the unnatural visage of Nordic Mark. The shattered pieces of its previous incarnation lay at its feet. "Hello?" muttered Green-Eyed Mark,
quite appropriately this time. Mark II said, "We should probably leave him where he is." "Agreed, he's dangerous," uttered Mark III. The original Mark Berman, however, bracing himself for further clones and malformed monstrosities, added nothing to the exchange. Instead, he returned to the kitchen table, sat, and clutched the still warm mug of coffee. He would sip and sip until the whole sordid business was over. 4. March 5th. Steve Taylor, a member of Vanity's TST, technical support team, arrived at the home of Mr. Mark Berman, a low-priority call-out, at approximately 11 a.m. He had called ahead of his arrival, but Berman's phone was offline, according to the service provider. As Taylor made his way along the damp pathway to the door, he observed a number of silhouettes shuffling back and forth behind the thick blinds adorning the windows of the cottage. Assuming Berman had guests, the tech support operative thought nothing of it and proceeded to knock on the door. The door was promptly answered by a short gentleman of Oriental persuasion, with pinpoint eyes and bird-like features. "Mr. Berman?" Taylor prompted suspiciously. The man motioned for Taylor to enter, but remained silent. Upon entering the cottage, Taylor was struck by an overwhelming scent of fresh coffee and an unusual humidity. Standing in the vestibule, he heard dozens of voices, all of which seemed to be muttering indistinctly in similar, droning voices. The Asian doorman motioned towards the door connecting the vestibule to the cottage proper. Taylor opened the door and stepped into a dark fantasy. The cottage was crowded, filled with men and women of the most unusual sort. Each and every face was but a variation on a theme. Sometimes the look was feminine, but more often than not it was masculine. The creatures gawped with their pinpoint eyes, tempting Taylor into a surreal world of receding hairlines and sheer rock foreheads. And then a figure would approach with wide, protruding eyes and long flowing hair, followed by his or her twin, bulbous noses sniffing the air as if in search of prey. Taylor retreated, plunging himself deeper and deeper into the depths of the cottage. There, in a shadowy corner of a large living room, he observed copulation. Malformed, armless figures plunged wildly into hellish hermaphrodites. The sounds the act elicited were shrill and deafening, the act itself seemingly excruciating for its participants. Rows of motionless, green-eyed clones silently watched as the horror unfolded. Coughing and spluttering as he stumbled out of the room, the tech support operative soon found himself in what appeared to be a dining room cum study. Amongst the strange bodies littering the room, his eyes fell upon the shattered display screen of the true reflection unit, the remaining fragments of which continued to reflect the room, but only the room, not the writhing forms of the deformed and perverted surrounding it. Gasping for air, he retreated, and in his confusion found himself in the kitchen, which was evidently the primary source of the overwhelming smell of coffee. Across the room, beyond the inconsistent shapes and forms of the bird-like brethren, Taylor observed a steaming coffee pot, and beyond that, in the fertile garden outside, stood a group of tall, blonde mannequins, their stillness akin to members of the Terracotta Army. The horror was overwhelming, but Taylor maintained his composure. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of something. A quiet figure, at odds with the other individuals in the cottage, was sitting quite calmly at the kitchen table, his hands clutching an empty mug. The man's face held a look of dejection, but Taylor also saw a touch of guilt, and in a moment of dawning realization, he recalled the words probability and accountability as whispered amongst members of Vanity's DT development team. Indeed, something truly horrifying had beset Mr. Berman, and the third-generation true reflection was responsible, or rather, the greedy directors at Vanity Limited, who had rushed out an appliance unfit for public consumption. The implications were astounding. "Mr. Berman?" Taylor finally prompted, moving towards the hunched figure. But it wasn't the man at the table that answered, rather the occupants of the room. Every man, every woman, every ghastly variation proffered a response. "Yes?" they replied enthusiastically. But Taylor's eyes remained fixed upon the man at the table, the template from which the nightmare scenario had unfolded. The tech support operative joined him at the table and whispered once again, "Mr. Berman?" "I saw it in the garden first," Mark mumbled. "It fell and came apart. Then there was another in the wardrobe. I killed it." Taylor frowned, but continued to listen. "Then I found one in the crawl space, just like me." "What happened to that one?" the tech support operative asked nervously. Mark Berman looked up, shrugged, and simply muttered, "I'm just going to sip till it's over." Taking no chances, Steve Taylor fled the cottage at Brookend and proceeded to log what was deemed an unprecedented case with the development team at Vanity Limited. Some weeks later, Berman's neighbor, Mrs. Finch, made several complaints to the local authority regarding a lack of activity at the cottage. The subsequent police investigation led to the discovery of an empty property, with evidence to suggest that a large party or gathering of some sort had taken place in the days or weeks prior. Amongst the clutter, no physical evidence was recovered to suggest foul play, though one officer proposed that an elaborate staging had taken place, citing the presence of industrial cleaning products not typically found in your average household, though the purpose of such a staging could not be determined. The only traceable witness was Mr. Steve Taylor of Vanity Limited, who was responding to a service request on behalf of the reclusive 30-year-old regarding a faulty piece of equipment. The police swiftly approached the tech support operative, hopeful his statement would provide information pertaining to the whereabouts of Mr. Berman. In the interrogation room, Taylor was extremely nervous, and it is owing to a curious remark made at the end of the questioning that investigators are to conduct a second, more thorough search of Berman's cottage. Statement of Steve Taylor, Vanity Limited Tech Support, continued. "It is my belief the events that transpired at Brookend were the direct result of faulty components developed by Sancor Incorporated, unprecedented faults to which Vanity Limited cannot be held accountable. You see, true reflection is just a receiver. It is designed to receive and reflect, nothing more. You wouldn't prosecute a camera for capturing indecent images, would you? The unit probably drove him mad. He was a loner, you see. He obsessed over his appearance, hence the kit. The people he parted with were most likely vagrants, transients who moved on when they finished trashing the place. But as for Mr. Berman himself, who knows what happened to him? Has anybody checked the crawl space?" "Hello?" That time of the night. That time of the night, between 2 and 3 in the morning, when neither day nor night seem absolute. That quietest of hours in the quietest of towns, when the busiest streets are free of vehicles and pedestrians. And if folks are to start up their cars or kick up their heels, they drive or pace in haste, for the quietest of towns are unnerving after dark. In the depths of that hour, when most of us are sleeping, hidden things come out to play. They pour from the gutters and crawl from under stones. They whisper in the alleyways and groan at our windows. Like mosquitoes in the dark, they're drawn to our essence. They employ every trick to force us to perceive, to make us believe. But as the bell tolls 3, they simply retreat,
returning to the safety of hidden places. From dawn until dusk they watch from the shadows, inhumanly patient, awaiting that hour, that quietest of hours, that deserted, uncertain time of the night. If I recall correctly, it was Thursday when I first heard it. I'd switched the light off, rolled over in bed, and pinned the sheets between my legs in that inimitable way only a bachelor in a king-size bed can. Superstition meant that the closet door was closed, and the window was open. Most Thursdays, out there in the still of the night, the sounds of distant places would lull me to sleep, tempting me to dream, as if able to carry my thoughts on the night air to their sources, slow-moving traffic, the lapping of waves on foreign shores, and the night song of insects in the woods. But that particular Thursday, just after 2 a.m., things were much too quiet, as though the familiar sounds I'd grown to depend on had retreated, making way for this new thing, this uncertain thing, whatever it was. Had I buried my head under the stack of pillows surrounding me, the sound that met my ears that night might have escaped my attention, but the wind carried it through the window, along with the faintest whiff of TCP antiseptic, willing me to hear it. Something was in motion out there, rattling, the sound of rusty joints. An old bicycle, I thought. It was a shrill sound, the kind of tone that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end, like nails on chalkboards, ambling towards my window. In the end, I must have drifted off, as the memory of the sound as I heard it that night has faded. The following night, I heard it again. Perhaps a neighbour was working on a bicycle in a nearby yard, basking in the cool night air, enjoying the quietude. It was quite possible he or she shared my sentiment for that strangest of hours, choosing to exploit its unique properties. But as the sound grew louder, I grew agitated. The jarring, high-pitched screeching of those old wheels was preventing my descent into slumber, and so I climbed out of bed and approached the window. As I reached the window and poked my head outside, the sound abruptly stopped. Gazing out onto the road, I searched for the source of the horrible racket, my eyes slowly adjusting to the amber glow of the street lamps. I saw parked cars and the smattering of trees, the phone box and the twin bollards across the street, the steeple of the Bethel church and its tiny graveyard, and lastly, the weary and dilapidated house of the late Walter Ainscough. But no bicycle. Carefully, I looked again, and noticed something. An out-of-place curiosity illuminated by a street lamp some 100 feet or so beyond the phone box across the street. It was a wheelchair. An empty, wooden wheelchair. Although I couldn't be certain it had been the source of the din, a chill ran down my spine as I regarded its orientation. It faced my window. I pulled the window shut and hastily returned to bed. Fortunately, I didn't hear it again that night. Saturday night, I lay awake. The anticipation was killing me. I knew I would hear it again. I could feel it. The familiar sounds of the night had died off just after 2 a.m., then replaced by that new, eerie silence. Repeatedly, I plunged my head under the pillows, hoping to drift off before the need to come up for air overcame me. I should have just closed the window, but it was so bloody hot I couldn't bear it. Besides, what was I afraid of? I dunked my head under once more, but I failed in my efforts to remain there. I peeped out, grabbing a lungful of that stuffy air, and in that moment, that creaking, appalling racket assaulted my ears once more. Worryingly, the sound of what I prayed wasn't that old wheelchair was louder than it had been the night before, as the piercing, dissonant melody of those accursed wheels ambled in my direction, I fought to resist the urge to climb out of bed and look out of the window. I tried so hard to will myself to sleep, to will myself to ignore it, but I just couldn't. I threw back the sheets and, with my hands over my ears in an effort to block the din, I approached the window. Just as it had the previous night, the sound ceased as I reached the window, though this time it wasn't necessary to reassess the scene below to locate the source. The chair, that ugly, dilapidated wheelchair, was right across the street, parked silently beneath the Bethel's entrance arch. The amber light of the street lamps poured onto it, illuminating its blemishes. Deep cracks and ridges crisscrossed its worn seat and backrest, beneath which those wheels, the source of that ear-splitting racket, flaunted corroded spokes, the brittle metal tinted chocolate brown and cherry red. Once more its orientation filled me with dread. The scarred wooden backrest of that ancient chair looked as if it was in possession of a face, riddled with lines of age, eyes of mist, and teeth of rot. Those elderly features scowled at me, as if preparing me for some hideous encounter. Urgently, I once again yanked the window shut and jumped back into bed. In a panic, I switched on the lights and flicked on the television, praying the horrible cacophony of that nightmare chair would spare me further torture. My prayers were answered. Other than the hum and prattle of the television, there were no more sounds that night. But I didn't sleep too well. I dreamt of the wheelchair with the wooden teeth. It was down by the Leeds-Liverpool Canal, and it was after me. In my dream-weakened state, I could barely move, and the old machine continued to gain on me as I tried desperately to outrun it. Passing the barges and the willows along the banks, even the shrubs fought to hinder my progress, their green limbs clutching, eager to feed me to that ravenous, cacophonous chair. The wail of its rusty joints threatened to tear me apart, to swallow and digest me in some foul, hellish abyss. I shot up in bed, sweating like a pig. The television was still on, the documentary, Northwest Waterways, ending. Feeling brave, I flicked the television off, dimmed the lights, and lay back down. All was quiet. I slept till noon. The first thing I did when I awoke was look out of the window. Thankfully, the wheelchair was nowhere to be seen. I wasn't surprised, as it was said that hidden things returned to hidden places during the day. But that thought worried me too. The thought the chair could be hiding in the grounds of the Bethel, among the scrubs off Alma Road, or behind the sheds in the late Walter Ainscore's yard. He had been wheelchair-bound, hadn't he? Those places were quiet, dark, and mostly undisturbed. The hidden things of the hidden places were said to watch from the shadows, plotting, whilst we, the unwitting public, continue to go about the trials and tribulations of daily life, oblivious to such things. But I was oblivious no longer. I had seen it, a hidden thing, which meant I would see it again, over and over again. Looking out onto the familiar street scene, I recalled the peculiar case of James Pennington. He had been a local lad, with a teenager's interest in the occult. What that meant was, he shuffled tarot cards and carved Ouija boards, sometimes urinating on his possessions in ironic attempts to imbue them with his essence. He was peculiar, off the charts peculiar. He often sang to owls in churchyards, claiming owl chant was good for the soul. But the whispers regarding Pennington's doppelganger, that was something else entirely. Could it have been the result of the things he dabbled with? No one really knows, but it went something like this. Pennington's girlfriend, an out-of-towner called Danielle, was spending the weekend with him at his parents' home, the latter away on holiday. Danielle, too, had an interest in the macabre, and often partook in his strange practices. At around 2 a.m. on the Sunday, that time of the night, James had answered the call of nature, later telling friends he had heard his girlfriend engaged in conversation with persons unknown whilst he was out of the room. Returning to the bedroom, he found Danielle unresponsive. Her face was pale. Her eyes were focused on a dark corner of the room. Pennington said it had freaked him out, especially as his dog, a terrier called Max, would often sit mesmerized for hours, its eyes fixed upon that very corner of the room. Several days later, following a period of silence, James's despondent girlfriend began to talk. She told him, quite fearfully, that she had watched his doppelganger emerge from the wall. The entity asked her questions about the man in the toilet, specifically about the suppleness of the skin about his face. Danielle swore the stranger looked exactly like Pennington, though his face, she noted, was rubbery, like a mask. Pennington, despite his supposed cool regarding such matters, was unnerved, inferring that discourse with the doppelganger was to invite it into one's life. Undoubtedly, the invited would take steps to replace its twin. Curiously, 3 days later, Pennington disappeared, but his disappearance wasn't supernatural. His body was never found. Well, most of it wasn't. A fisherman, on his way to one of the many ponds of what the locals call the Bonnies, made a gruesome discovery in one of the fields. He stumbled upon the naked body of a young girl, though in place of what should have been her face was a mask of human flesh, haphazardly stitched from brow to chin, ear to ear. Local police later revealed that the girl, Danielle Green, had stabbed her boyfriend, James Pennington, to death, subsequently flaying his face with a blunt knife. In her attempt to wear the grisly shroud, she had succumbed to blood loss as a result of flaying her own face in order to replace it. Strange things aren't uncommon in my neck of the woods, and just as Pennington brought the mentally unstable Danielle Green into his life, I shuddered at the prospect of what I had brought into mine. Sunday, that time of the night. There were no sounds during the witching hour, nor any between 2 and 2:45, and so, assuming the hidden thing had skipped a beat, I flicked off the television, dimmed the lights, and pressed my head firmly into the pillows. I was on the verge of sleep when I heard it. It sounded as it had before, that terrible, agonized screeching. But, disturbingly, it wasn't the night wind that carried it to my ears. The sound was dampened, as though heard through plasterboard or floorboards. I opened my eyes and scanned the black shapes in the darkness. The wardrobe with the board games stacked upon it, the freestanding mirror, the clunky computer desk and the dusty CRT, the softly billowing curtains in front of the window. The sound persisted, but its source wasn't out there in the night, nor was it in the room with me. It was downstairs. Like a frightened child, I pulled the sheets up over my head. The act of doing so seemed to lure the thing closer. The screeching amplified, and I could smell it. Oh, the stench of old leather and rusty iron. Pervading the room, the odour crawled into the bed with me and filled my nostrils. As I lay there, clinging inanely to the pillows, my mind rejected the harsh reality of what was assuredly an impossible chain of events. Quite suddenly, the screeching sound terminated at the foot of the bed, and instead, I heard laboured breathing, a sort of gasping for air. The spluttering was coupled with a distinct whiff of TCP antiseptic. A latent memory returned to me, a vision of the late Walter Ainscough across the street, weeding the garden as he often did in his twilight years, bound to a rickety wheelchair, choking dandelions, his aged face cracked and worn, coughing and spluttering, cursing the yard. I recalled the irrational fear I used to feel as I watched him from afar, just a lad, barely 12, afraid of the old man, brought up on a diet of too much horror and not enough empathy. Blind as a bat, old Walter was, searching the air for sounds, grasping at weeds from the confines of that ancient chair. Irrational or not, I always felt he knew I was watching. There it was, the memory I had buried, the vision of old man Ainscough, wheezing in that chair, dying, his marbled, listless eyes glaring up at my window as he writhed. In his death throes, he'd spotted me, and he knew I was the only witness to his demise, but I had been too fearful of his outward appearance to intervene, and much too afraid to tell my parents afterwards. I remember hurling myself under the sheets, praying I would never meet that terrible gaze again. But my suppressed guilt had brought him back from the darkest gulfs to punish me for my sin, my childhood secret. And then came the hands, those weathered hands that had once yanked dandelions from the yard across the street, hands that had choked weeds and flowers alike, moving under the sheets, reaching for me. I could smell him, incontinence and TCP. It hit me like a ton of bricks. His spluttering frame inched up the mattress, his immobile legs dragging behind him. As his calloused hands grazed my calves, he mumbled between breaths,
hidden things, come to thee 'tween 2 and 3.
And with those words, the festering frame of old man Ainscough disappeared. My eyes are on the clock. It's approaching that time of the night. I know he's there. He's always there, parked across the street under the yellow glow of the street lamps. He's waiting to curse me again and again, just like Danielle Green cursed James Pennington. But I can handle it. The lights are on, and the hum and prattle of the television keeps the whining at bay. The window stays shut now. It's just that damned smell, leather, iron, and the faintest hint of TCP antiseptic.
The Stroll. The man picked himself up, brushed the dust off his jacket, and studied his surroundings. The room was grey and featureless, with low ceilings and crumbling walls. There was nothing in the room other than the source of a dull luminescence, a cloudy bulb hanging from a thin length of cord above him. The man in the jacket recalled little of how he came to be there. In fact, he recalled little of anything. But he wasn't concerned. He focused on the room, the emptiest of spaces. An opening in the far wall revealed a passageway, lit in a similar fashion to the room, with further openings beyond. Taking one last look about his sparse surroundings, the man strolled towards the opening. The corridor was much like the room, grey and devoid of aspect. The man counted 7 openings, including the one from which he had emerged. Another 2 cloudy bulbs illuminated the passageway, one of which flickered intermittently. Perceiving the flickering to be a signal of sorts, he proceeded to its nearest opening. Another passageway. This corridor presented a further 3 openings, and an additional cloudy bulb. Again, the space was dull and entirely absent of detail or decoration. The man in the jacket took several paces in the direction of the first opening and paused before it. Within, he saw another room,
much like the room in which he'd initially found himself. And similarly, it was empty and utterly stark. The man thought for a moment. He considered the starkness of the rooms and the sparseness of the corridors. Where was he? He heard a faint droning, an undertone, its origin unknowable. Noting the bulbs, he knew something had to be supplying them with electricity. Perhaps the drone was the distant hum of a generator of some sort. In the silent shadows of the strange structure, the man in the jacket found the air to be musty, and could taste its staleness in the back of his throat. It wasn't particularly unpleasant, just noteworthy. Regardless, it continued to fill his lungs whether he liked it or not. Detecting a slight airflow, the man followed it through dozens of identical corridors and empty rooms, determined to reach its source. But after many extensive and undetermined periods of time, he discovered absolutely nothing of note. Eventually, he took the decision to return to the spot in which he first detected the airflow, the corridor with the 3 openings, and through the structure he strolled, noting again the plainness of the corridors and the mistiness of the bulbs. The weird palace of dereliction in which he wandered fascinated him, so much so that his thoughts strayed from contemplation, instead focusing upon individual, singular actions. He looked to the swinging of his arms, and the sound of crumbling stone beneath his heavy boots, the silent inhalations and steady exhalations, as his frame turned a corner or shuffled through an opening, the shower of shadows cast by bulbs, chaotic and intermingled, and the grace of his progression, slow and deliberate. Though it all lacked a purpose he could clearly define, the man in the jacket continued. He wasn't concerned. Eventually, he happened upon the first corridor. The flickering bulb in the neighbouring passageway was the only indication he'd reached it. He approached the dying source of light and, guided by the airflow he had so fastidiously followed, returned to the first room. Full circle, but things were different. There was a figure standing in the centre of the room. The man in the jacket identified the being as humanoid, but it wasn't human. Much like the room, the entity was grey of skin. It was entirely hairless, and absent of any distinguishing features, other than the outwardly recognisable auditory, ocular and olfactory systems adorning its pale face. Its mouth, barely a slit, opened, and the being spoke to the man. "Hello," it said. "It has been a good while since I've had the pleasure of company." Speech seemed to cause the being discomfort. Each sentence ended with a tortured wince and a peculiar frown. The man in the jacket hesitated. "Pleased to meet you," he replied. "I very recently found myself here, wherever here is." The being approached the man and placed a hand on his shoulder, its needle-like fingers thrumming the fabric of his jacket. The corners of its mouth raised in a smile, the effort as painful to the being as its words had been. "Follow me," it said, grimacing. And so the man in the jacket followed the being through further rooms and further corridors. Slowly they moved, proceeding with the utmost care, the being noting every flickering bulb they passed and every misshapen stone they trod upon. In some places, the being would study the length of the cords attached to the bulbs. In others, it would observe the contours of cracks along a given wall, absently nodding when certain trivial details were recognized. Reaching what was assuredly the largest of all the rooms the man in the jacket had thus far entered, the being led them to a slight recess in the far wall. The flat stones within formed what appeared to be a place to sit. The being gestured towards the alcove. The man obliged, sat, and the entity joined him. "Forgive me," it said. "I know not how to converse." The man in the jacket twisted his head to face the being. "Well,
We speak the same language, he returned. That's a start. The being simply gazed ahead, its deep-set eyes unreadable in the dimly lit gloom of the largest room. Do you seek answers? It asked. I seek very little, the man replied without hesitating. But if you care to share your story, I'll gladly listen. Again, the entity winced as it grinned. Though we do indeed speak the same language, it began. We come from different worlds. This place is accidental. By all rights, it should not be here. Sometimes worlds are injured. They bleed linear time. If the wound goes untreated, it spills out into the anti-world. The anti-world? The man asked. Yes, a place beyond space and time, the being answered. Look around you, it continued, motioning towards the dark walls and the hazy bulbs. There is nothing here, nothing but the rooms, the corridors, the bulbs and the cords. It is a terrible, terrible place. It is a structure untethered that bled out into the anti-world. It is a remnant of a world that once knew time and still retains its essence. And though its walls continue to crumble and its bulbs continue to flicker, it is not subject to entropy. This place cannot change, and its inhabitants cannot leave. The man in the jacket frowned. Then how did we come to be here? He asked. We have always been here, the being affirmed. There was truth in the words of the being. Perhaps he had always occupied the structure. The thought alone offered an explanation as to why his presence in the odd labyrinth didn't seem to concern him. Eternity could quite simply be the singular acts of breathing, strolling from room to room, and conversing with the humanoid. But the entity had more to say. There is a door, they say, it whispered. They? Asked the man in the jacket, lowering his voice in kind. The others who roam this place. There are others? Yes, though our meetings are infrequent. The humanoid smiled. Its pale cheeks were once again forced to accommodate the painful expression. What's this about a door? The man pressed. They say the structure has to have a door, as its manufacturers would have required a point of entry. The man in the jacket pondered the assumption. Perhaps they didn't intend for anybody to get in or out, he said flatly. The being frowned, an excruciating frown. I do not believe that, it said. I believe there is a door, and soon we will find it. We? The man echoed. Yes, the being answered, for you are the one who first spoke of it. The humanoid rose and once again smiled in his direction before disappearing into the depths of the structure. The man in the jacket sat alone on the stone seat. His eyes remained fixed upon the cloudy bulb overhead. He was tempted to follow the being, but he lacked the motivation required to do so. Above the ever-present drone, he thought he heard distant voices. Several words found his ears: door, manufacturers, and structure. But there was nothing encouraging in those words, nothing motivational. He just wasn't concerned. The man picked himself up, brushed the dust off his jacket, and strolled. Rainman. The death of William McLaughlin. It's like something out of the X-Files, I said, aghast. It was close to midnight, and to my horror I'd been called out to investigate the death of a child, a 7-year-old boy by the name of William McLaughlin. The boy's father, Patrick, had discovered the body after his son had failed to respond to his shouts following the preparation of supper.
Concerned, Mr. McLaughlin approached William's room tentatively. Rain was lashing down outside, making it difficult for him to focus on anything but the sound of it. He knocked and placed his ear against the door, but still his son failed to respond. Finally, he had flung the door open, hastily flicking the light switch. There on the floor in the centre of the room lay his son. William's face was pale, and there was no movement. In a panic, Patrick rushed over and attempted to resuscitate him. His attempts were unsuccessful. Bizarrely, William's body was soaked head to toe. Mr. McLaughlin had searched frantically for his mobile phone and proceeded to call the emergency services. While waiting for the ambulance to arrive, he noticed another oddity: a number of sodden indentations in the carpet next to William's body. The depression seemed to lead to the window, though it didn't appear as though it had been opened. The ambulance had arrived some minutes later, and the paramedics pronounced William dead at the scene. I was called shortly afterwards. The McLaughlins lived in a detached mid-17th century cottage at the end of a quiet street in the coastal village of Wren in the Scottish Highlands. Myself, a city detective for more than a decade, had earlier that month relocated to Wren from Manchester, having reached the grand old age of 50. After what I saw that evening, I wish I'd stayed in the city. It was so very strange. The cause of his death, I mean. One of the paramedics, James Turner, had called to inform me the boy had drowned. In the bathtub? I queried. Well, that's the odd thing, Detective. Though he isn't anywhere near the bathtub or any body of water, he's totally sodden. Where was the boy found? I insisted. On the bedroom floor. No signs of a struggle? No. I hesitated before responding. I'll be right there. It wasn't worth continuing over the telephone. I needed to see the body for myself. And so there I was, trying to put the pieces together. A young boy drowned in his bedroom, unusual indentations on the carpet, and a father who claimed to have heard nothing out of the ordinary. Andrea Nelson, a forensic investigator known throughout the region, was called to the scene due to the bizarre nature of the case. She was keenly analysing the indentations on the carpet. "Jack," she said, "take a look at this." I approached and gave her my full attention. Judging by the distance between these impressions, the general shape and distribution, I think we're looking at footprints. I frowned, echoing, "Footprints?" "Yes, footprints," she repeated. "Bare feet, actually. I'd say whoever it was exited via the window there." Nelson motioned towards the window across the room. The trail of footprints led directly to it from William's body. "There's just one thing, though," she added. "The indentations move in one direction only, towards the window, which means the perpetrator was probably already in the house. It was raining heavily around the time of the boy's death, which precludes a window entry, as the perpetrator's sodden footprints would be visible in both directions." She paused. "And then, of course, there's the method of drowning. It was incredibly localized. No spills, sprays, or drips." I shook my head dismissively, returning, "So what are you saying? Some barefooted killer hid in the boy's cupboard waiting to inexplicably drown him using some method unknown to us before slipping out of a second-story window and disappearing into the night?" Nelson shrugged. "Well, I'm not saying that exactly, but the evidence seems to suggest as much." "Christ," I returned. I wasn't having any of it. As a result, I ordered a thorough search of the cottage. I was convinced the perpetrator was still inside, hiding somewhere, clutching his drowning paraphernalia and a sodden towel. But the search of the McLaughlin cottage yielded nothing at all. Patrick and Matilda McLaughlin were questioned regarding their activities, queries relating to places they might have visited or company they might have kept. Patrick fleetingly referenced a recent trip to the Isle of Skye, though nothing about the family excursion had been particularly noteworthy, Just your typical sightseeing affair. The death of William McLaughlin was quite the mystery. The Legend of Rainman. Back at the station, I discussed the situation further with Nelson, firm in my convictions that her forensic knowledge was second to none. Unfortunately, she had nothing else to add. Not long after my conversation with Nelson ended, I received a telephone call. Still to this day, I don't know who it was. The connection was poor and there was a lot of interference, which is always the case up in Wren following a thunderstorm. The individual, who sounded local, was a young male rambling endlessly about Loch Carushk, one of the larger lochs on the nearby Isle of Skye, and something he referred to as Rainman. The call cut off mid-conversation, leaving the questions I had for him unasked. The Isle of Skye. Hadn't Mr. McLaughlin visited the island recently? I called Mr. McLaughlin immediately, asking what he knew of Loch Carushk. His answer was simple. He, Matilda, and young William had visited the lake along with a number of other tourists 2 days prior to his son's death. Unfortunately, the tour had been cut short due to rain, and that was as much as he had to say on the subject. Following my conversation with Mr. McLaughlin, I spoke to my deputy, Andy, who had grown up on the Isle of Skye, the island itself part of the Inner Hebrides, some 10 miles from Wren, across the Kyle Arkin. He was familiar with Rainman, stating it was local folklore going back decades. According to the legend, centuries earlier, a nomadic Norseman roamed the highlands. The stranger was in search of a mythical elixir said to belong to the elusive dwellers of certain mountainous regions. Eventually acquiring that which he sought, it was said he retreated to a quiet lake he discovered some years earlier, Loch Carushk, shrouded by the black Cuillin Mountains on the Isle of Skye. There, on the banks of the hidden lake, the Norseman remained, sustained by the strange medicine he had so fervently coveted. The legend insists he lives there still, calm in his solitude. Those who disturb his quietude are said to pay with their lives. They say he's a kelpie, you know, Andy went on. A neck or water ghost. I nodded reluctantly, remaining silent. He continued, "It isn't just Nessie we got up here, you know." Andy told the tale with such fervour that I felt any disbelief on my part would be offensive to him. Continuing, he referred to Loch Carushk as the Dread Lake, and spoke from experience about the eerie silence there prior to the onslaught of malevolent storms. "Rain is his warning," Andy said, almost nonchalantly. "Warning?" I repeated. "Aye," he nodded, his face stony and severe. In the short time I'd been in Wren, I'd yet to visit the Isle of Skye, let alone Loch Carushk. There was something about the name Dread Lake that really put me off, and the isolation of the place was off-putting too. You had 2 options if you wanted to pay it a visit: a boat from Port Elgol or a 2-day hike from the Bay of Camasunary. But considering the McLaughlin's trip, Andy's story, and the strange call I'd received, I felt the need to head out there. The Dread Lake. The following morning, Andy and I drove out to Port Elgol. We'd arranged passage aboard a small fishing boat, having absolutely no desire to accompany the tourists on a Misty Isle boat trip. The old fisherman, Deckard, took us out. I can feel the chill now. 7 a.m. on a late October morning, mist clinging to the dark waters, heading into what appeared to be a vast assembly of black, craggy towers under blankets of fog. The old fella Deckard was sure to share his 2 pennies worth regarding the legend of Rainman. "Oh, aye, Rainman, aye. Carushk's his home. Aye, it is, lived there many a moon, strays out from time to time." His words were less than encouraging as we plunged into the mist. "So, what exactly is Rainman?" I asked tentatively, looking for an alternative explanation. "Who knows, laddie? Best not to ask," Choosing to acknowledge the man silently, I raised my eyebrows and nodded. Andy climbed to his feet and wandered across the small deck. The fine, morning drizzle had soaked his raincoat. Deckard gazed ahead. "She's preparing for winter, the old lock, so she is," he said wistfully. "Doesn't really like visitors this time of year. Just be thankful it's October. Wouldn't he be doing a trip like this November through February?" I joined Andy as we approached a rocky outcrop full of seals. The things looked playful enough, flapping and yapping like dogs on the rocks, but I couldn't help thinking that they were trying to tell us to turn back. Deckard docked at a small wooden pier. "I'll be staying on board, lads. Be back by 11. I nodded. "Watch your backs," he added. "They doesn't know what that there dread lake has in her belly." I can't say I'm particularly fearful of water, but there's something inherently creepy about isolated bodies of water. Their untold depths, the secrets lurking beneath. It's just a lake," I returned with a grin. "Never just a lake, laddie." Deckard winked before reaching for a flask. Andy and I climbed the rough banking and made our way upwards along an old trail. The trail crisscrossed several small pools before leading us to an area of large boulders and flat rocks. We traversed the length of a babbling brook and were soon met by the dread lake herself. Under the early morning fog, she was haunting, but beautiful. Surrounded almost entirely by craggy peaks and the Black Kulin, Karushk appeared as though she was supposed to be a secret. She spoke to me in ways Mother Earth never had before, hinting at an untold history, misfortune she may have witnessed over the centuries. We hiked along the easternmost edge towards the northern shore, where the eerie loch fell into shadow beneath the tallest of the Black Mountains. I jestingly remarked how on a clear sunny day the loch would be an absolute joy to traverse, whilst secretly harbouring an irrational fear of the place. I was convinced there were eyes on me. And no wildlife. Where were the gulls? Clearly the loch was beyond the reach of the seals, too. The sense of isolation was strong as we hiked. No sounds other than the drizzle of rain on the water and a low, incorrigible wind. Still to this day, I'm not entirely sure what my plan was. Had it been just to get a feel for the place? Or had I secretly known that there was more to the lake than just water? Even if that was the case, what on earth did it have to do with a 7-year-old boy from Wren? Andy held a map, nothing more than a scrap of paper really, detailing a rough outline of the loch. On the map he'd marked the location of a disused campground, an area from which a lone hiker had allegedly disappeared some years earlier. We found the area with relative ease, noting evidence of recent usage, the vague remnants of a pit fire. Had the McLaughlins ventured this far? Had the boy stumbled upon something? I doubted it. The loch was, after all, a tourist spot. Although it looked bleak and totally unexplored that morning, Andy reminded me that there had been visitors all summer long. What if this Rainman is nothing more than a hermit? You know, an old fellow living up in the mountains, I ventured. Perhaps he uses this pit fire here on the colder winter nights. Andy shook his head. Jack, do you know how harsh winters get around these parts? There was scepticism in his voice. A mountain man living out here, he continued, motioning towards what was assuredly a barren, challenging environment. I had to agree with him. Even if there was a mountain man, the thought occurred to me again. What possible connection would this hypothetical hermit have to a 7-year-old boy from Wren? And just as the thought crossed my mind, Andy and I saw something. Is that a person out there? Andy asked, squinting. Surely not, I said. Unsettled, we studied what appeared to be a figure bobbing up and down out on the dark water. From where I stood, I could have sworn it was a man. It's hard to mistake the telltale characteristics, the head, the limbs, the torso. We watched as the strange shape slowly swam towards us. The mist above intensified, blurring our vision. We could hear the splashes, the distinctive clapping of human hands on the surface of water. But the overall impression visually was that of transparency, a trick of the light. And then it was gone. The fog lifted, revealing nothing but the black waters of the dread lake. The sense of solitude I experienced in the moments that followed was truly magnificent, though unfortunately it was short-lived. I felt Andy's eyes on me, and so I turned to meet his gaze. The colour had drained from his face, leaving a pale shadow of the young deputy behind. His eyes were lifeless, glazed and bloodshot, like maraschino cherries. "Andy," I said, coaxing absolutely no reaction out of him. I approached, concerned. "Andy," I repeated. Nothing. As I neared him, his mouth slowly began to open, forming a perfect O. I hesitated and whispered, "Andy?" He returned a low, despairing groan. Coughing and spluttering, he produced several mouthfuls of water. I lunged forwards to intervene, but I couldn't reach him. Something unseen blocked my path. My instincts told me to flee, but I couldn't. Have to help Andy, I thought. And then he collapsed to the sandy shore. I raced to his aid and was about to attempt to resuscitate him, when the young deputy opened his eyes and looked at me. "What happened?" he muttered. "I'm not really sure. Are you okay?" He nodded. Pulling Andy to his feet, we turned and made our way back to Deckard's boat. Whatever had happened that morning, we were eager to get as far away from the cause of it as possible. The burden of memory. We returned to Wren. The old man Deckard had been appalled to learn of Andy's mysterious collapse. I explained it away as a lack of food and water, not wanting to further incite the old man's already inflated belief in the supernatural. Back at the station, I discussed our time at the lock with several officers, as the thunderstorm that had so battered Wren the previous evening returned to hammer us a second time. It was around then that Andy Gordon's lifeless body was discovered in the men's room. I couldn't believe it. Just as the case had been with the McLaughlin boy, Andy was saturated, and a bizarre series of wet footprints led across the tiled floor of the men's room towards an open window. The post-mortem revealed the cause of death as drowning, just like young William, despite the fact Andy had been discovered alone, lying face up in the middle of the men's room, away from the toilets, away from running water. I felt it pertinent to mention Andy's collapse up at the lock to the medical examiner, who simply and unsurprisingly responded with a frown. As a result of this tragic turn of events, I decided to pay the McLaughlins another visit. It turned out Patrick McLaughlin was aware of the Rainman legend, claiming his father had introduced him to the idea some 35 years earlier. Patrick told a peculiar tale of how he and a group of friends on a stormy afternoon had watched in horror as a neighbour, an elderly gentleman by the name of Clifford, had fallen to his knees on the corner of Harbour Street, coughed up a massive quantity of water, and drowned before their very eyes. I could tell there was more, and the man hesitated before adding, "I saw Rainman that day. He spilled out of the old man and just disappeared." "Did you ever tell William this story?" I asked. I didn't want to ask, but it was my duty. Again, Mr. McLaughlin hesitated before answering. "Yes," he said quietly, "just as my father had told me a similar story." And so it seemed the legend went back generation after generation, townsfolk inexplicably drowning, in the middle of town, in their beds, always drowning, always Rainman. I told Patrick of my visit to Loch Karushk, and I caught a glimpse of anxiety in his eyes as the words left my mouth. "The dread lake," I added, and proceeded to relate the circumstances surrounding the visit and the events as they transpired on the northern shore. Patrick heaved. "What happened to you up there?" I probed, locking eyes with the man. "Not to me," Mr. McLaughlin responded, his voice barely a whisper. "To William." He paused. "What happened to your deputy? Happened to William?" After several moments, he regained his composure and asked quite sincerely, "Will it ever be over?" I had no answer for him. The end of the line. That same evening, around 7:45 p.m., I sat at home, scotch in hand, gazing out the window, watching the rain as it bounced off the windowsill. I felt unsafe. The rain used to calm me, but the death of the boy and Andy had changed all that. I stared intently at a tree out back. It jittered under the weight of the rain, almost as though it was trying to alert me. And then I saw it. A shape passed in front of the window, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. Then, above the sound of the rain, I heard a faint trickle, water seeping into the room somewhere. I panicked. I switched the overhead light on and searched frantically for the source of the trickle. The front door. A steady stream of water was flowing into my living room. The capacity for rational thought left me, and I fled towards the back door. Unlocking it, I ran out into the garden and gazed back towards the house. It was the strangest thing. There in the doorway stood a person? No, it couldn't have been a person. It was more like a silhouette, the shadow of a person, inexplicably cast into the doorway. But no, that wasn't it either. It had substance, and it was aware of me. Though I could see right through the figure, it blurred the objects behind it. The shape refracted them, like observing things at the bottom of a swimming pool. Something really was standing in my doorway, and it was composed entirely of water. I stood in the pouring rain, glued to the grass, my eyes fixed upon what I so desperately wanted to believe was nothing more than a trick of the light, a hallucination. But I knew better. The previous day had taught me that I had to know better. And then it stepped out into the rain with me, and I lost sight of it for a moment. Then I saw it again, its strange extremities illuminated by nearby street lamps. It walked away from me, out onto the street. I followed it, watching as its watery legs ambled and its aquatic arms swung. Eyes wide, I gazed as the entity approached a curb and slowly poured itself into a drain, disappearing into the hidden underworld of Wren's sewers, returning to the dark, secret depths of that dread lake. Had it come to drown me like it had the McLaughlin kid? Like Andy and countless others over the long years? Or had it come to warn me of something else, something worse, waiting to take the lives of those who mutter its name in the company of strangers and loved ones? I left Wren. I quit the force. I moved overseas to a warmer climate, the south of Spain. I check the weather forecast often. If there's a storm on the horizon, I seek out the company of friends. I leave mention of Rainman on these pages, and these pages alone.
Letters from the village. Of all the distant objects on Federal Hill, a certain huge, dark church most fascinated Blake. It stood out with a special distinctness at certain hours of the day, and at sunset the great tower and tapering steeple loomed blackly against the flaming sky. It seemed to rest on especially high ground, for the grimy facade and the obliquely seen north side with
sloping roof and the tops of great pointed windows rose boldly above the tangle of surrounding ridgepoles and chimney pots. Peculiarly grim and austere, it appeared to be built of stone, stained and weathered with the smoke and storms of a century and more. H.P. Lovecraft, the haunter of the dark. To reflect upon what I now know to be true seems almost trivial, but the journey and the subsequent revelation is of such significance that I feel the penning of this manuscript is the only way to make sense of it all. But it isn't for my benefit. It is for he who is to follow in my footsteps, and let me assure you, my friend, your cause is the continued existence of the human race, or so I've been told. But I digress. Allow me to start at the beginning. The letters began a few days after I returned from a September trip to the northeast. I had been based in Northumberland primarily, though one of those 7 days away took me up the coast into Scotland. A local in Eyemouth, a shopkeeper with a penchant for Coltsfoot Rock, recommended a hidden gem, a natural harbour near Coburn's Path, by the name of Cove. A sucker for seaside delights, I drove the 13 miles or so along the coast until I found the place, almost by accident. I parked the car and ambled down the stony pathway in the direction of the harbour. Traversing a shadowy tunnel, necessary to access the harbour proper, I gulped at the pick marks on the rock. If only those long-dead miners had known of the role they had unwittingly played in determining my fate. But in the end, I suppose the tunnel, the picturesque beach, and the balmy ocean are of little relevance here. What is relevant is the strange sense of homecoming I felt upon reaching Cove. At the time, standing alone on the sand, surrounded by towering cliffs, I didn't really notice it. It was triggered afterwards, having ascended the rocky track back to the car. Overlooking the bay, I noticed the wistful expressions of the faces comprising a memorial commemorating the East Coast fishing disaster of 1881. One of the figures was pointing out to sea, and although I was sure that the arm of the statue had been extended for many years, I felt as though it was gesturing for my benefit. Perhaps there was something I had overlooked down by the harbour. And so, once again, I descended the stony trail and returned to the water's edge. Indeed, I had missed something. Among the seaweed and the deadwood, I noticed an old briefcase. I dragged it ashore. It was assuredly ancient, as revealed by the faded leather. Quite possibly, it had been at sea for decades. Regardless, I was eager to explore its contents. Inside, I discovered a stack of photographs. Most of the images were entirely blank due to water damage. 3 of the images, however, were fused together. A careful peeling apart revealed detailed pictures, their sepia tones suggestive of a time and place. Several faces in those damp frames were somehow familiar to me. In photograph number 1, Township, I'll call it, was a village scene. Standing in the foreground were a number of colourful townhouses and cottages, behind which a large mound rose above. Atop the mound stood what appeared to be a massive church or cathedral. Its true size was difficult to ascertain, as its lofty pinnacles ascended beyond the boundary of the frame. The second photograph, Matches is what I wrote on the back, revealed a wooden table filled with typical household items. A Timothy White's and Taylor's matchbox was the only identifiable item among the clutter, which, if nothing else, served as a means to approximate the age of the photograph. According to my research, and considering the pristine condition of the matchbox, I estimated the photograph was taken in the early 70s. Photograph number 3, Old Friends, I'll refer to it now, featured 4 familiar faces. From left to right, Simon Drinkwater, a fellow I went to school with; David Tusk, a skinny carpenter my father had worked with in the 90s; a red-headed chap I was absolutely certain was my grandfather,
Alan Anforth, and the diminutive Lorraine Cowell, another absent friend from my school days. The picture was problematic for me on several levels. Firstly, if the shot was indeed taken in the early 70s, then my school friends, presently some 30 years of age, couldn't possibly have attended such a shoot. Secondly, my grandfather certainly wouldn't have been the age he is today in the shot. And lastly, the likelihood of such an image existing in the first place, and subsequently falling into my possession, was very doubtful indeed. But there it was, weathered by time. Returning to the car, I crossed paths with an elderly lady walking a dog. The terrier wasn't too interested in my scant frame, but out of sheer politeness I greeted the woman with a stock pleasantry along the lines of, "It's gorgeous down there." In return, she smiled and muttered something I still to this day recall with perfect clarity. "It's God's country. She built it so we could rise again." Just the rambling of a good Christian? But all this is just a prelude to what, as I stated, began several days later. The first letter arrived on September 27th, 2015, in a tarnished envelope, with my name, Martin Mencken, scrawled across the front in neat cursive. There was no return address overleaf. Curiously, the envelope was stamped with a pink Philympius stamp, circa 1970, aligning perfectly with my assumptions regarding the age of the second sea-weathered photograph. It's also pertinent to add that the postman wasn't in the habit of delivering mail at the weekend. Carefully, I opened the letter, noting the stiffness of the paper, as though withheld by persons unknown for untold years. I unfurled the single piece of lime paper within and studied it. It read as follows. "Dear Martin, I hear you're thinking of paying us a visit. I can't encourage you enough. Dick's got a contractor working on Cotton Row. I assure you, the stones are as bold as Marie said they would be. You'd love it. It's got that sense of yesteryear you're always talking about. Think of the view over Ambleside from Royston's. Imagine that, then picture a mighty cathedral atop Todd Crag. Oh, Martin, you won't believe it. You simply have to see it with your own eyes. It's hardly surprising Maria's kept it a secret all this time. It's just unbelievable. When the forest welcomes you, it truly welcomes all of you, if you get my meaning. I do hope you'll visit. You won't want to leave, I promise you that. Love and wishes, Deirdre." I felt strange reading those words. There was a personality in that prose that resonated with me somehow, but it was illusory. It had to be. To fully appreciate the implications of that old note, I feel it's important to tell you, my friend, a little more about myself. I was born in 1983, back when fashion was absurd, and the synthesizer defined popular music. Never one to dwell on the merits of the present, I spent my formative years looking backwards, always backwards. Memories of intimate moments were exquisitely powerful, and consistently outweighed the sensations of the present. This feeling was amplified as I entered puberty, and further still as I achieved adulthood. Relationships were fiery, and, poetically I suppose, were consistently extinguished by the gusts of the present. If I were to sum up my life experience in a single word, it would be this: melancholy. And so the letter, that simple, tattered offering from the past, pulled at my heartstrings, imploring me to pursue its shadowy suggestion through untold passages of time and worlds unknown. I felt as though I'd been given the key to a hidden kingdom, another dimension, a realm in which the romantic fantasies and dreamy escapades of a man out of time were tangible, albeit forgotten. Then came the second letter, lending further credence to my absurd fancies. It too was signed Deirdre. The name didn't mean a thing to me. But again, there was something in her handwriting that struck a chord. It read as follows. Dear Martin, we're so very happy to be hosting you at last. You'll be staying at Ivy Cottage. It's the blue cottage overlooking the brook. The access road is a little tricky to find, so we'll send Dick to meet you in Wooler. If we say October 2nd, 12 p.m., I hope that works. The end of Station Road should suffice, by the water. I can't wait to see you, old friend. Take care till then. Love and wishes. Deirdre. The letter wasn't dated, though it was October 1st when I received it, leaving me fewer than 24 hours to contemplate the appointment. I felt an irrational desire to drive to the Northumberland village of Wooler on the off chance it was indeed intended for me. But how could it be? The name and address was simply a coincidence, wasn't it? But in the end, I didn't make the journey. Instead, I sat and pondered the letters and the curious faded photographs from the water-damaged briefcase. There were 22 images in total. I wondered whether any of the remaining 19, excluding township, matches, and old friends, could be improved in some way. Despite my best efforts, including the digital manipulation of 18 of the images, I was about to conclude that the remaining photographs were beyond enhancement. But the 19th, as luck would have it, had something to offer. A minor detail, really, but fortuitous nonetheless. It was a signpost. It read, "Welcome to Nunwich." Nunwich. Was this the mysterious village Deirdre's letters were alluding to? The hamlet in which that tattered photograph revealed in sepia tones quaint cottages and a striking cathedral? I searched for the elusive town on the web. When my exhaustive searches yielded nothing in the locales of Northumberland and the Scottish borders, I studied the old Ordnance Survey maps my parents kept in perpetuity. No Nunwich. I discussed the matter with family and friends, posted queries on internet forums, but still, Nunwich was nowhere to be found. Was the village overseas? Possibly, if one entertained the idea that the strange briefcase had been carried across the North Sea from continental Europe. But had it? Having missed that October 2nd appointment with Dick, I brushed aside both the concept of Nunwich and of the peculiar, parallel life I secretly longed for. And then the third letter arrived. I noticed the difference immediately. The penmanship on the envelope was rough and impatient, premonitory of the disappointment scrawled within. Again, I opened the letter carefully, mindful of the ripened paper's delicacy. I wanted to be convinced of the letter's authenticity as a token of the past, but I couldn't help but liken the mien of that discoloured paper to the tea-stained treasure maps I had baked in the oven as a child. Deirdre's third letter read, "Martin, I'm disappointed. We're all disappointed. There's room in the Skywell for 12. Are you asking us to take the plunge without you? Dick says he'll give you another chance, but I have to tell you, Simon and Lorraine have all but given up on you. They say you don't care, that you've given up. The defense cannot operate with 11. We need you. Marie doesn't trust outsiders as it is. Please, please, don't let us down again. Let the verse serve as a reminder. When she fell from the sky, she shattered the stratosphere. Like rain she poured, as life we formed. When she fell from the sky, she lived to climb again. She built the well, and now we rise again. The wall of vines, Martin. We'll climb it together. October 17th, 12 noon. Dick will be waiting. Same place. Please, don't let us down. Deirdre." The letter chilled me to the bone. Not only were Simon and Lorraine, the faces of the third photograph, mentioned by name, but lines of the included verse were reminiscent of the cryptic words proffered by the dog walker back in Cove. It's God's country. She built it so we could rise again. Who on earth was she? It was October 15th. I don't know why, but I wanted to make the journey. It's assured that strange things happen in these lives we live, though the rational mind tells us that synchronicity is nothing more than coincidence. But I'd never been one to shy away from superstition. I
worshipped the idea of the weird and wonderful entering my life. I wanted to pursue it to its end, even if that end was foreseeable and ultimately mundane. Who was it that said the destination is unimportant? It's the journey that counts. And so I decided to hit the road, hopeful a local or two in Wooler might have heard of what was presumably a ghost town, the village of Nunwich. If not, perhaps the aforementioned Dick would be there to meet me at noon. At the time, I lived in the northwest of England, in a small, historic hamlet nestled in the shadow of the West Pennine Moors. The drive to Northumberland was some 3 hours by car, and, a lover of northern England's majestic heaths and dales, I, as was my preference, opted for the scenic route. That was the morning of October 17th. I was determined to reach Wooler before noon. I pulled into town just after 10 a.m. and parked in the centre, just off High Street. The quiet town of Wooler was especially tranquil. The shops, the deli, apothecary, butcher's and general store were all closed, but the post office appeared to be open, and so I entered, intent on broaching the subject of Nunwich. The clerk, an elderly lady with a grimace like a corkscrew, tipped her head in my direction as I approached. Despondent and in muted, disgruntled tones, she claimed she'd never heard of the place, her certainty the result of being married to a member of the Northumberland County Historical Society. How convenient. Abandoning my line of inquiry, I stepped back onto the chilly street, gazing in a northerly direction. A dog walker approached, a senior gentleman in a beige overcoat, an overweight Jack Russell close at his heels. Quizzing the old fellow, who was just as nonchalant as the lady in the post office, he misheard my pronunciation of Nunwich. "Dunwich?" he croaked. I assured the man I was not in search of Dunwich. Traversing Church Street and the Path, Ramsey Lane and Oliver Road, encounters with members of the general public were fleeting, though one exchange with a youngster on a bike at the top of Broomy Road left a lasting impression. I collared the boy as he emerged from an anonymous-looking lane. Nunwich?" was his response to my question. "The place in the mist?" But he was unable to elaborate, as something to my rear apparently caught his attention and compelled him to flee. Despite my efforts, I was unable to keep up with him, as the rusty old bicycle carried him away at speed. The time was slipping away. My watch read 11:46. My meet and greet with Dick was imminent, if it was my meet and greet. And so I returned to the car and headed in the direction of Station Road. Stepping away from the parked car at 11:56, I made my way to the banks of Wooler Water. The area had been wet of late, and as such the brook was engorged, roaring by me uncharacteristically. You see, I'd visited Wooler twice before, in the summer months, and had found the brook to be rather quaint. The villagers, too, in previous visits, had been more welcoming, and had never minced words. There was something odd about them this time round, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But if I were to pluck a word out of the air to describe the experience, I'd once again choose homecoming, for somehow the situation was suggestive of some inexplicable convergence at my expense. Noon came and went, along with a number of intermittent showers, forcing me to seek shelter beneath the protective limbs of an oak by the river. There had been no sign of Dick, not that I had ever really expected there to be, but my dash for cover had revealed something. Wedged between two curiously placed stones by the trunk of the tree was an envelope. I recognized the handwriting upon it immediately. It was Deirdre's. As before, the name scrawled there was mine. I quickly drew the logical conclusion that it hadn't been there long. Returning to the car, I proceeded to open the letter, the sound of rain on the aluminium roof adding to the sense of anticipation. Deirdre's familiar cursive glared up at me. It read, "Martin, Dick is a little concerned about the weather in Wooler, so he's heading out a little earlier to leave this letter for you. It's
difficult to explain, but if the rain is falling, the road to Nanich is practically impossible to traverse. I beg of you, take this letter, check into the Black Bull, and await further instructions. I hope you have made it this far, old friend. Remember, you are number 12, and we will always think of you that way. Yours, Deirdre. My journey wasn't over after all, but I felt assured somebody was playing games with me. Had it all started in Cove? That bloody briefcase? Perhaps it had, but it didn't matter. I was a player in the game, and I wanted to see it through to its conclusion. The Black Bull was, and still is to my knowledge, a 17th century public house on Wooler's High Street. I made my way there, and was satisfied with it as an appropriate place to sit and wait out what had become a rather tumultuous storm. I entered the pub, having escaped the worst of the downpour, and positioned myself at the bar. I ordered a blueberry cider. Attempts to engage the barman in conversation were largely unsuccessful, so instead I retired to a booth, keen to avert the penetrating glare of the elderly punters, each of them eager to assess the interloper. Eventually, having grown tired of the clandestine whispering and surreptitious eyeballing, I followed through on Deirdre's suggestion to check into the hotel and decided to await further instructions in one of the rooms upstairs. It was quiet up there. I gazed out onto High Street, watching the hustle and bustle of the town's denizens. At around 4 p.m., I drifted off. When I awoke, I immediately glanced at the clock beside the bed. It displayed 6:45 p.m. It was dark outside, giving license to the oppressive glare of dim, yellow street lamps. Approaching the window, I glanced across the street. The storm had ceased, and the town was deserted. There was an eerie stillness about the place. Heading downstairs into the pub, I was surprised to find the place empty, though the lights were on, and a few of the tables still held the remnants of pub grub and pint mugs. Peculiar. I proceeded out onto High Street through the open door, and again came upon that desolate scene, the glare of dim street lamps and the subtlest vapour hanging in the air. Looking north in the direction of Glendale Road, I noticed a figure at the junction of the two streets. It was signalling me with a wave of its hand. Could this be the elusive Dick? Noting no other signs of life on the deserted thoroughfare, I headed towards the figure as it retreated onto Glendale Road. I proceeded a mere 20 paces in order to reach the junction, but was shocked to discover that the shadowy character had continued several hundred paces or more along the road, and was now little more than a blot on the horizon. I followed. This game of cat and mouse persisted for what felt like an eternity, until eventually I found myself standing at the end of a mist-veiled, tree-lined highway. The trees towered interminably into the sky, and I could barely discern the canopy in the fog. The figure had disappeared, leaving me quite alone. Undeterred by the bewildering situation in which I found myself, I stepped forth into the gathering darkness of the unmarked road. I followed that highway for what felt like hours, the scenery black and unchanging as I progressed. Then, quite suddenly, an incredibly familiar signpost met my eyes, a board bearing the words, "Welcome to Nanich." I'd made it. The elusive village of Nanich, under a cloud of mist. And so my guide must have been Dick, though his indefinable nature had left a sizable thorn in my mind. If this whole thing was an elaborate ruse of some sort, where were the other perpetrators? Practical jokes require an audience, do they not? Witnesses? The culprits were insistent upon keeping themselves at a safe distance. But why? The sun had started to rise, spilling its warm, crimson hues onto the mysterious township, threatening to banish the early morning fog. Like Wooler, Nanich was completely deserted, utterly devoid of life. Then,
Beyond the wispy clouds, I saw the colourful cottages as mentioned by Deirdre in the first letter. Cotton Row. And there was Ivy Cottage at the far end, my supposed abode. I continued, wandering amongst curious statues of men and women, all pointing towards something as of yet unseen, their postures strikingly similar to those of the monument I'd obeyed back in Cove. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the remaining clouds of fog dissipated entirely, revealing the heart of the village, the church or cathedral on the mound, the foundations of which I'd glimpsed on Polaroid, the grandeur of which had been proclaimed in Deirdre's first letter. I studied the outline of the structure, its numerous spires clawing at a sky not beyond its reach, threatening to pierce the stratosphere itself. I followed the topmost pinnacle to its zenith, my neck twisting in an attempt to behold it in its entirety. The tower was otherworldly, I thought. It certainly wasn't of Northumberland. If it truly stood within the quiet forests of northern England, how could this Marie, or whoever she was, have kept its presence a secret? It seemed impossible. It was not of this earth. Not of this earth. The phrase went round and round in my mind as I tried to process the vision, from the smoothness of the black stones comprising its exterior to the ethereal and unearthly presence it commanded. The cathedral was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, and I was hesitant to approach that monstrosity. I wanted to know more about Nunwich and its former inhabitants, if, in fact, the term former applied, and so I set out to investigate. Initially, my search of the village yielded little. I wandered from empty townhouse to deserted cottage in vain. The dwellings had been abandoned in what appeared to be an orderly manner. Kitchen surfaces had been wiped clean, and ornaments and other personal items had been safely stowed away in cupboards. But documentation pertaining to the identities of the mysterious occupants was nowhere to be found. Photographs and portraits were entirely absent, too. It was upon entering Ivy Cottage, however, that I discovered the true nature of the reclusive cult I, or my namesake, had been invited to join. The cottage, a quaint stone structure with traditional sash windows and a thatched roof, was accessed through a small oak door. I stooped as I entered, narrowly avoiding the lintel. The entrance led directly into a galley kitchen, where upon the worktops I discovered a handwritten booklet. The book contained information regarding what was assuredly a cult of the most unusual nature. The first page was a sort of members' index, including, amongst others, the familiar names Alan Anforth, Lorraine Cowell, Simon Drinkwater, Deirdre Johnson, and David Tusk. But it was the 12th name that sent a shiver down my spine. My name, Martin Mencken. I flicked cautiously through the pages, some 30 or so in total, observing rules of sect and curious diagrams detailing the procession of the spheres. I saw crude sketches of reptilian creatures, often engaged in writhing, bestial activities with human men and women, entirely unclothed, labelled as the children of the Skywell. The contents of that leather-bound booklet were disturbing, to say the least, especially so when my gaze fell upon the final page, a detailed depiction of a rectangular opal pool surrounded by 12 naked figures bent in prayer. The caption below it read, "Humble are the few who rush to her aid." Accompanying the booklet was another faded letter. "Martin, be humble. Leave your clothes and possessions behind. We await you upstairs. Yours, Deirdre." To decipher the enigma, I knew I had little option but to climb the mound. Upstairs, of course, referred to the church, that dark, monolithic behemoth ever present in the back of my mind. Few moments in life prepare us for what is to follow, yet even when the message is clear and the way has been marked, it is still much too easy to remain oblivious. And that was what I had become, ignorant. I felt like an automaton, straying blindly into the fray, unprepared for the dangers so clearly outlined upon the pages of that strange, handwritten booklet. But regardless of the risks, there were answers up there, awaiting me in the lofty heights of that precipitous tower. And so I returned to the deserted streets and headed in the direction of that treacherous mound, along a path of wild grass. The ascent was steep, but not grueling. There was a deep, undefinable sense of exultation which filled me with a sense of purpose, allowing me to crest the hill with little effort. When I turned to gaze upon the township below me, the mist had returned, blanketing the scene below. There was nothing to see other than the grass at my feet and the mighty church above me. I approached the monstrosity, straining to catch a glimpse of its topmost spires. It was composed of vast, onyx stones, each the reflection of its neighbor, entirely free of embellishment. The facade lacked windows or any other kind of aperture, save a simple Gothic archway at the base, beyond which a set of double doors awaited me. A shiver travelled along the length of my spine as I approached that formidable entrance. The doors were ajar, and I hesitated as the unabashed darkness within called to me. I wiped a bead of sweat from my brow and stepped into the archway. As per Deirdre's message, I discarded my clothes and shuddered as my bare flesh met the chilly November air, if it was November, in silent Nunwich. I crossed the threshold. That the building atop the mound wasn't a church or cathedral, I am now positive. For hours I wandered through its empty halls and deserted corridors, shrouded as I was by that interminable darkness. I cannot be certain I saw anything with my eyes, but I can say with absolute conviction that some dormant region of my primitive brain perceived images and sensations beyond comprehension, and it wasn't long before I began to interact with them. Soon enough, I observed the spontaneous birth of luminous shapes in the void, gathering into a mass of intent. The apparitions approached me, and somehow I was told they had been summoned to carry me up into the inexplicable heights, beyond the realm of darkness, to a place of light and wonder. My naked body acquired a phosphorescent glow as the seemingly sentient objects surrounded and lifted me beyond the reach of the other things now forming in the darkness. I heard strange, dissonant cries of frustration as the Dark Ones, in vain, clutched at my ascending frame. I was swiftly transported to a precipitous ledge, beyond which I glimpsed a wall of vines. The luminous shapes faded into the blackness surrounding me, but my body remained positively charged, my flesh continuing to glow, illuminating the wall ahead of me. I knew I had to climb it, and, instinctively, I knew I wasn't the first to climb it, that perhaps it wasn't the first time I had climbed it. But all too quickly, my skin was losing its radiance, and, aware of the malevolent, dark ones in the shadows, I commenced the climb. And up I went, higher and higher into the unknown, driven by a powerful fear of the dark. To attempt to describe that ascent now is akin to describing one's birth. We know of our births, but unlike our first steps or the muttering of our first words, the memory of birth belongs to a being unfamiliar to us, a being evacuated from a cavern of darkness. And as I clung to those ancient vines, I became that being, fleeing the shadows, gasping for life. When at last I reached the chamber, for that's what it was, a large, brightly illuminated space, I collapsed, tumbling onto the cold stone floor. My heart thumped in my chest, my breathing erratic. The Dark Ones returned to the pit,
their exacerbated moans forever etched into my memory. Gaining composure, I dragged myself up in order to view the chamber in more detail. In the center of the open space, a still, opal pool caught my eye, its mirror-like surface reflecting the ancient, featureless walls surrounding it. A single beam of light fell from above, striking the delicate surface of the water. The sky well, just as it had appeared in the handwritten booklet. But there were no others in attendance. Beside the pool, I saw another familiar item, a briefcase, exactly like the one I pulled from the surf, though much less time-worn. Pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. I edged closer, that ever-present sense of homecoming devouring my senses. As I neared the pool, visions of decadent Persian bathhouses entered my mind, figures submerged, thrashing about in unbridled opulence. But the sight before my eyes wasn't that of extravagance, rather that of the simple, bare aspect of the abyss, a black, featureless void, eager to receive me. And I saw that the dark water had received others too, 11 in total. I counted each and every floating body, pale and lifeless, and uncannily still, as if frozen in time. Those familiar faces looked up at me from the sky well, their expressions blank. Fate had received them, a fate determined by a belated attendee. Was that me? Or had some other cult member abandoned the children of the Skywell in the 70s? In any event, what was the purpose of this otherworldly ritual? But in my heart, I knew I was number 12. Those letters had only ever been meant for me. Somehow, I was a member of that elusive group, and I had to join my family in that water, had to know what they knew. And so, unthinkingly, I clutched the briefcase and stepped into the water. I sank like a stone. It was a curious sensation, not unlike the impression of falling we sometimes perceive moments after falling asleep. But this fall was indefinite, a plunge deep into the depths of a mind of some sort, a tunnel of memories, a catalogue of moments, a collective consciousness. The briefcase disappeared, and I was no longer aware of anything in the physical sense. I was simply a disembodied cell, a neuron, transmitting a message of unknown significance. Myriad memories assailed me, images of far-flung destinations and friendly faces, Drinkwater, Tusk, Grandad, myself. It was as though I had merged with the children of the Skywell, our experiences fused in an involuntary attempt to understand or overcome something. The power of our combined experiences grew exponentially, forming an expanding sphere of purpose, until, quite abruptly, the bubble burst. I awoke with a start in my room at the Black Bull Inn. A marvelous nightmare, one for the dream diary. If only. For when I returned home the following morning, there was another letter waiting for me, one final letter. The penmanship was different, though. It didn't belong to Deirdre, and the envelope was new, crisp. I opened it without hesitation. It read, "Dear Martin, this is going to be difficult to explain. Please bear with me. As a member of the defense, it is my duty to protect the being we refer to as Marie. Marie is all things, Earth and its many life forms, Nanich and the Onyx Tower. The Skywell allows us to communicate with her directly. It's a blessing, but it's also a vulnerability. The darkness that dwells in the bowels of the Onyx Tower wishes to eliminate her, to smother all living things. And so we defend her. We plunge into the pool and force the darkness to retreat. But our efforts thrust us into the past, to begin the search for the Onyx Tower anew, to drop into the Skywell over and over again. It's a strange, convoluted road, my friend, but the defense is the linchpin. As long as we continue to seek the Onyx Tower, Marie will continue to live, ensuring the survival of all things. I hope you understand the implications. I eagerly await our next revolution. Yours, M. I glanced up at the clock on the wall. There, beneath the giant hands ticking inexorably forward, I observed the date. September 3rd, 2015, 2 days before I departed for my trip to Northumberland, the very trip in which I had discovered Cove and the briefcase. I didn't want to believe it, but it all made sense. The briefcase and its contents were simply a means by which to jog my memories of Nanich and the Onyx Tower. The letters that had so perplexed me had been meant for me, withheld for decades by the members of the defense, patiently awaiting my return. And that last letter, the handwriting so familiar, was penned by me, a man out of time. I had become an instrument of our continued survival, the survival of the human race. I was a gatekeeper, a proprietor of the world of men, both living and dead, a member of the defense. And so I finally understood the words of Deirdre, that fateful verse. When she fell from the sky, she shattered the stratosphere. Like rain she poured, as life we formed. When she fell from the sky, she lived to climb again. She built the well, and now we rise again.
The Pit. My town is one of those backcountry, middle-of-nowhere places in which word-of-mouth folklore and wild superstition defines its population. It's the kind of place a visitor might hear ethereal music in the woods or catch a glimpse of an out-of-place animal roaming the empty fields. If your senses are attuned to such things, then you might even notice strange graves carved into the slopes of gullies, or old ropes tied to the limbs of withered trees, the trunks riddled with bullet holes. But we know of something else, ineffable horrors dwelling in the depths of an abandoned, isolated coal mine. Local legend tells of a pit, a dark place in which some 300 miners lost their lives in a colliery disaster over a century ago. So the story goes, a number of miners had complained about the perilous conditions in the mine on several occasions, many citing bad omens, including the presence of carrion crows in the subterranean depths, and some even claiming to hear the unlikely neighing of startled horses in the ghastly, myriad passageways. But the miners' pleas went unheard, resulting in the catastrophic explosion that led directly to their deaths. Whispers exchanged over an ale at the Painter's Greyhound tell of survivors, starving miners entombed in the labyrinthine tunnels honeycombing the cold earth beneath our town. Occasionally the ground opens up and swallows things, dilapidated sheds in the corners of houses, sometimes people, fodder for the ravenous miners, and pets abandon their owners, dogs disappearing into shadowy recesses, and cats straying deep into the wilderness, never to be seen again. As the saying goes here in my town, all victims at pit. The location of the pit, over the course of a century, was mostly forgotten. Knowledge of the disaster itself conveniently buried by those with more pressing political and financial interests. The Audis, though, as they're known in these parts, are still in possession of memories, and often recount unsettling tales passed down through the generations. If it hadn't been for my grandfather, I, at the tender age of 14, might never have set out to find the pit that day. The route related to me was both protracted and disorienting. Seekers at pit must first descend into told ravine, my grandfather muttered through false teeth. A route at one time commonly frequented by my sort. Follow to oaks and silver birches along told trail marked by red bricks of Scooth's cottage, and you'll reach Bald Hills. You know Bonnies, don't you, boy? I nodded, for I did know the Bonnies, and still do. Unnatural rooks carved out by the long-perished miners, barren and unwelcoming, suggestive of untold mysteries and the forbidden knowledge they served to protect. My grandfather continued, That awkward terrain, boy, coupled with those dark ponds, can lead one to Dog Wood, a forested area intersected by confusing, abandoned lanes leading deep into what we call the sterile art of the back country. You'll know Dogwood by density at Thunderbrush, though you'll have to look closely if you want to find the cursed entrance. To this day, I still don't fully understand why my grandfather encouraged me to seek it out. His warning as I left that day often returns to me on dark, foreboding autumn afternoons. Boy, 'tis nothing to look, 'tis everything to see. See yourself, and know the escape the darkness. But I was just a 14-year-old lad. How was I to know what he meant? My best friend, Key, knocked on my door at 7:15 a.m. that fateful October morning. We walked the length of Park Road and plunged headlong into the old ravine. The thing we sought somehow was already with us, and was working to discourage us, descending upon the golden-brown foliage in the form of mist. We pressed on. The discovery of the silver birches was fortuitous, for beyond them we soon observed the red bricks of Scooth's derelict cottage. Moss and creeping ivy caressed the old stones joylessly, consuming what had once been the jewel of the ravine. Just like Scooth, its time had passed. The cool, morning air met us as we climbed the slopes and stepped out onto Bonnies, also known as the Bald Hills. It's quite a thing to experience both the absence and evidence of man simultaneously. But that was just how it was, standing there on the old rooks, a man-made landscape, abandoned, nature working to reclaim what it once possessed. The gravelly mounds hissed at us, exposed to the brisk, autumnal wind. Key and I traversed the hills hastily, avoiding the ponds, motionless bodies of water concealing horrible depths rumoured to connect directly to the old tunnels, flooded passageways where the survivors were said to roam. In a moment of hesitation, we shuddered. We saw the tree line on the horizon, dense foliage forming a seemingly impenetrable wall. A cloud of mist hovered above the forest, threateningly. It whispered, "Turn back." But we didn't turn back. We happened upon that most sought-after location, Dogwood. Brushing the nettles and brambles aside, we discovered an old pathway, the tiniest amount of gravel still visible beneath the grass and weeds. Mist shielded much of what lay beyond, so we stepped onto the path and made the conscious decision to keep to it. Deeper and deeper we drove into the underbrush, working hard to clear the path of shrubbery and other hindrances, blind to the inherent dangers one should be aware of in the proximity of a disused coal mine. A capped shaft presented itself as such a danger, several rotten timber planks straddling its hideous mouth. Luck was to thank for preventing an unfortunate tumble into the blackness beneath. The remains of an old railway line brushed against our boots as we closed in on our destination, the innumerable limbs of large trees clawing at the rusty tracks zealously. Key was the first to note the change in the air, a staleness, a rancidity that had visibly affected the flora of the wood. As we neared its source, we saw fewer and fewer nettles, brambles, and ferns, vegetation in general seemingly afraid to flourish in what my grandfather had referred to as the sterile art of the back country. Withered trees stood defiantly, though the souls the roots might once have harboured had long since departed. Even the soil, gelatinous mud, had been affected by the otherworldly blight. And then we saw it, the great arch, marking the entrance to the site of the pit. The arch, an iron monstrosity, once beheld the name of the mine, though upon our observations the bold lettering had mostly eroded. 3 rust-nibbled letters remained. P-I-T. Trepidation begged us to flee, to return to the familiar comforts of home. The quiet town centre host to Margie's sandwich shop and Gilbert's newsagents, the ancient sprawling cemetery on Church Street, and Pollock's School for the Deaf under the willows on Grundy Street. Even the lone silhouette of Lightning Tree standing atop Broomhead's Hill was an image I would have happily traded for that of the dark, deathly visage of Deepest Dog Wood. We trudged onwards until we came upon the mere. It filled us with dread. My father, a regular up at the Painter's Greyhound, said the seniors often spoke of an old mere, a pond but a stone's throw from the pit. Allegedly, the old miners used to wash their hands and faces in it, steadily darkening the water with coal. Other kids, in times gone by, who had set out in search of the mine, had happened upon the mere. Alarmed by the shade of the water, most had turned back, though some strayed too near and were never seen again. One lad, the Audis would say, caught a glimpse of something strange in the still water, and in the grip of some inexplicable mania fled and threw himself into the pit. Witnesses, 2 of them, returned from the wood in a near catatonic state, claiming the lad was pulled into the mouth by dark, ashen hands. The lad, like the others, was never seen again, and there was no investigation into his disappearance. The Audis said the lad was cursed. That there mere's a flexion of that there pit. That lad should have kept his eyes off both. They's got for to see thyself if they wants for to live. Braver than most, Key and I approached the old mere and glared into the murky water. I swear to this day I've never seen water as dark. The face that looked back at me, a strange, warped version of my own, haunts me to this day. As for Key, he offered no description of what he saw in there. Stepping away from the mere, we scanned our immediate surroundings. Beyond a smattering of withered silver birches, a trail marked by a rusty chain-linked fence led to our destination. Tentatively we approached, mindful of the eroded metal fencing poking up out of the gelatinous earth, sharp and menacing. Some 15 paces further, and we were upon it. The pit. Blackened, charcoal-like trees loomed eerily above it, their poisoned limbs hanging limply, pointing towards the untold depths below. I still have difficulty describing it, not in terms of its outward appearance, as quite simply it was nothing more than a hole in the ground, some 15 feet in diameter. No, it was the inexplicable sensation that gnawed at my nerve endings and tugged at my faculties. That's what I have difficulty describing. To say the urge to flee was overwhelming would be an understatement. Staring into that black abyss evoked an emotional response unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was as though Key and I had discovered the eye of Mother Earth herself, and to look directly into it was a sin punishable by a fate worse than death. And we had been warned. The folk who fell into sinkholes, the curious kids who mysteriously disappeared, the pets that strayed too far from their owners, all victims of whatever it was that roamed those unfathomable passageways at the bottom of that accursed pit. As the eye glared up at us, my thoughts returned to that peculiar reflection I gazed upon in the mirror. And then there was movement below. I looked to Key and shivered. There was no conceivable way down into the pit, and as such no conceivable way up out of it. Was there? The movement came in the form of a sound, a shuffling, laboured progression, the sound of frail, ashen hands clutching blindly at the roots of dead trees. As the unsettling imagery sketched itself in my mind's eye with an incredible urgency, the all-consuming, rancid feta grew in its potency, so much so that I could almost taste it, my senses utterly assaulted by it. The clamour neared the surface, threatening to make eye contact with us in a matter of moments. Key and I stood, frozen to the spot, lips cracked, throats dry, inhaling the foul odour as it crept towards us. Seekers of the pit, the two of us sincerely regretting our inquisitiveness and impudence. As the nameless thing neared the surface, I turned and fled. Moments later, Key was at my rear. Heedless we were of the metal fragments strewn across the trail. Ignorant we were of the shadowy mere and the boggy underfoot as we raced out of Dogwood. Oblivious we were of the strange absence of fauna throughout the bold hills. Unconcerned we were as once again we plunged into the old ravine, passing Scooth's cottage and the silver birches. Thrilled we were as we made it to the safety of Park Road, gasping and collapsing to the merciful tarmac of a familiar thoroughfare. As Key and I walked home, not a single word was exchanged. Key and I attended school together the following day, but neither of us discussed the pit. That was our unspoken agreement, both secretly terrified, afraid that spoken acknowledgement of the thing we both knew was out there would confirm it, invite it back into our lives. But our pact didn't last. It should have lasted till the end of our days. We bumped into each other some 5 years later at the bar in the Painter's Greyhound on a dreary autumn evening. The memories spilled out of us, and though several Audis were eavesdropping, none of them had a word to say. Like the church steeple at the heart of our town, one memory stood out above the rest. A memory the both of us had attributed to the sordid weaving of a nightmare or folie à deux. There in the quiet pub, we described the strange sounds and the hideous feta we sensed in that instant before we took flight. But as I spoke of the moment I turned and fled, Key spoke of something else, something deplorable. From out of the pit had emerged the ashen hands and charcoal face of a long-dead miner. He claimed the very same face had replaced his reflection in the mirror. Its empty eyes studied him, and as it pointed a pallid finger in his direction, it whispered, "We are coming." It was with those fateful words Key had turned and fled. At the bar, his face fell, the colour running out of it completely. He looked up at me. "They're coming for me," he muttered. "I know it." The next day I received a telephone call. I recognised the caller as Daniel Tately, Key's younger brother. Daniel was morose, his voice but a whisper at the end of the line. There had been an incident at the Tately bungalow, one involving a sinkhole. I shuddered at the implications. The family had awoken in the early hours of the morning to a series of tremendous crashing sounds. Daniel and his parents, the latter of whom still refuses to discuss the incident, rushed to Key's bedroom, flung the door open and stood aghast as their son, brother, and my friend was dragged, kicking and screaming, into a gaping hole, malnourished, ashen hands clutching his head and arms. All this Daniel muttered in hushed tones. He spoke of Key's paranoia in the weeks leading up to the incident, an apparent preoccupation with the subterranean mines beneath our town, fears relating to the distant, muffled sound of pickaxes, and the latent idea that a nameless thing from the heart of the mines had spent 5 long years searching for him. In his mind's eye, he had watched as it traversed the flooded depths, clearing collapsed corridors, looking for the precise location in which to dig hundreds of feet upwards. And he had listened as the encroaching clamour fueled his imagination, coupled with what Daniel referred to as an odour, an overpowering fetor that even the family had noticed in the days leading up to the incident. It got him, Daniel said, and it had the pit, the occupants of the pit. Life in my town carries on. The few of us who remember such horrors exchange our tales in whispers over quiet ales in the painter's greyhound on chilly autumnal nights. Occasionally, I revisit that fateful moment Key and I gazed into that old mere. I saw myself. Key saw something else. As my grandfather once said, "Boy, 'tis nothing to look, 'tis everything to see. See yourself, and know the escape the darkness." Now, finally, I know what he meant.
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,